The auction was supposed to start at 9 o'clock, but by 8:30 the crowd had already gathered in front of Harlan's general store, spilling off the wooden sidewalk and into the mud of Main Street. It wasn't a large town, Caldera Crossing, population maybe 400 on a good census year, and most people had nothing better to do on a cold Tuesday morning in October than stand around and watch somebody else's misfortune play out like theater. Cole Mercer arrived on horseback just after the crowd had formed. He hadn't planned on stopping. He'd come into town for a bag of oats and a replacement hinge for the barn door, and he'd meant to be back on the road before noon. He tied his horse to the post outside the feed store and stood for a moment watching the people gathered down the street, trying to read the shape of it from a distance. Whatever it was, it had pulled in the feed store owner, the barber, 3 women from the seamstress shop, and a cluster of ranch hands who should have been working. Cole pulled his coat tighter against the wind and walked toward it. He smelled the crowd before he heard the words. Tobacco smoke and unwashed wool and something else underneath it. A kind of low collective excitement that never meant anything good. Starting bid of $40 for the woman and the child together, or we can separate them if any of you prefer. Cole stopped walking. The man on the wooden platform was named Gerald Purcell. He ran the town's only legal office, which in Caldera Crossing meant he did everything from writing wills to serving eviction notices to organizing debt settlements. He was reading from a paper in his hand, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of a man who'd learned long ago not to think too hard about what he was saying. On the platform behind him stood a woman and a small girl. The woman was maybe 28, 29, dark hair pulled back, the kind of face that might have been pretty under different circumstances, though right now it was pale and set into something between blank and terrified. She was visibly pregnant, 7 months at least, Cole guessed, and she was standing with one arm around the small girl and the other pressed against her side like she was trying to hold herself together. Her dress was clean but thin for the weather. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere above their heads, the way people do when they're trying to survive the next few minutes without breaking apart. The girl was maybe 5 or 6. She was pressed against her mother's leg with both hands gripping the woman's skirt, face turned away from the crowd. She hadn't made a sound since Cole arrived, and nobody around him seemed to find that strange. $40, Purcell repeated. That's for the woman. She's healthy. She can cook and sew and manage household work. The child is quiet, comes along with the purchase, or can be placed separately at the county home if the buyer prefers. Separately, someone in the crowd said, and a few men laughed. Cole felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was older than both of those things. He pushed through the edge of the crowd. What are these people being sold for? A man beside him, somebody he vaguely recognized as working at the livery, turned and said, "Widow woman. Husband died owing money all over the county. Purcell worked it out with the creditors. This is the settlement. She agreed to it." She agreed to it, Cole repeated. Signed the paper herself. Couldn't pay any other way. Cole looked at the platform again. The woman's eyes had dropped briefly to meet his, just for a second, before she looked away again. There was no plea in that look. She wasn't asking for anything. She'd already stopped expecting help from the crowd around her, and she was right to have stopped. "Do I have $40? Purcell called out. "40 for the 2 of them. Clean arrangement, full legal transfer of labor contract. 7 years for the woman, until the child is of working age for the girl." "35, somebody called from the back. "I have 35. Do I hear 40? Cole walked forward until he was at the base of the platform. "Hold it." Purcell looked down at him. "Sir, the bidding is open." "I know the bidding's open. I'm asking you a question." Cole looked up at the platform, at the woman. "You're Evelyn Hart?" She looked down at him. She didn't answer right away. "Yes." "Your husband was Daniel Hart?" A pause. "Yes." "He owed money around town." Her jaw tightened. "He did." "How much?" She blinked. It wasn't the question she'd expected. $212 in total, between the feed merchant, the bank, and 2 private lenders. Cole turned to Purcell. "That's the total debt? $212? Purcell shuffled his paper. $218 with fees. "And this is how you're settling it? Auctioning off a pregnant woman and her child?" "It's legal," Purcell said, and he said it with the confidence of a man who'd never had to defend legality to anyone who actually pushed back. "She signed the contract. The creditors agreed. It's a standard labor. It's not standard anything, Cole said. He reached into his coat and pulled out his billfold. He counted what was in it. He'd come to town with $240, nearly everything liquid he had, money he'd been saving since spring to repair the east fence line and buy a second draft horse. He looked at the bills for a moment. Then he looked at the platform. The small girl had turned her head just slightly. She was looking at him through the gap between her mother's arm and side, one eye visible, watchful, and still. $220, Cole said. Cash. The crowd went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Purcell stared at him. Sir, the current bid is $35. I know what the current bid is. I'm offering $220. That covers the debt plus fees, which means the debt is settled and there's no legal basis for any labor contract. Cole looked at him steadily. Unless you're telling me these women are worth more to your creditors as labor than as a paid debt. Purcell opened his mouth and closed it again. Didn't think so, Cole said. Eat. It took 40 minutes to work through the paperwork, which Purcell did in his office with the door closed and the blinds drawn, as if he was embarrassed by the arithmetic of it. Cole sat on one side of the desk and said nothing. Evelyn sat in the chair beside him with the girl in her lap, and she also said nothing. The girl's name, Cole had learned from Purcell's papers, was Clara. She still hadn't spoken. When Purcell finally slid the papers across the desk, debt settled in full, labor contract void, Evelyn Hart legally free of obligation to the creditors, Cole signed where he was told to sign and stood up. This is irregular, Purcell said one last time. A lot of things are, Cole said. Outside, the crowd had mostly dispersed. The cold had gotten serious and the show was over. Cole walked Evelyn and Clara to the feed store where his horse was still tied, and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, trying to figure out what to say. Evelyn spoke first. You didn't have to do that. No. You don't know me. That's correct. She looked at him. She was trying to read him, he could tell, trying to figure out what this cost her, what he expected in return. He'd seen that look before on people who'd been handed something and learned the hard way that nothing was ever actually free. I have a ranch, Cole said. 8 miles out, North Road. It's not much. One main house, a bunkhouse that's empty. Goodwill. I'm not offering charity. He stopped. I'm offering you a place to stay until the baby comes, and until you can figure out what you want to do next. Your own room. Your daughter's own space. In exchange, whatever work you can reasonably do around the place, cooking, mending, whatever you're able, and when you're ready to go somewhere else, you go. No contract. No obligation. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. Why? Cole thought about it. He owed her an honest answer, not a polished one. Because what happened back there wasn't right. And I had the money to stop it, so I stopped it. He paused. And because I have more rooms than I need. She looked at Clara, who was standing beside her now, still holding her skirt. Then she looked back at Cole. We accept, she said. Cole's ranch was called the Mercer Place, though he hadn't named it. It had come with the name when he bought it 11 years ago from a man named Hargrove, who was moving his family to Oregon. The house was solid, 2 stories, built from local timber, with a wraparound porch that had seen better decades but still held weight. The barn needed work. The fencing on the east side was the project Cole had been planning all summer, the one he'd just spent its budget on. He thought about that on the ride out and decided it was fine. The fence could wait another season. Evelyn rode in the wagon seat beside him, and Clara sat between them, pressed against her mother's side, watching the landscape move past with serious eyes. The girl was observant in the way that quiet children often are, taking everything in through her eyes because she wasn't letting anything out through her mouth. How long has she been like this? Cole asked, halfway out. Evelyn didn't pretend not to know what he meant. Since her father died. 3 months now. Shock? The doctor in the last town said so. Said it might pass on its own. Said there wasn't much else to say about it. Cole looked at Clara. The girl looked back at him with those steady, serious eyes, then turned to watch a hawk circling over the dry grass. She understands everything that's said around her? Every word. She just doesn't say any back. They rode the rest of the way in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, which was something. Cole had lived alone long enough that most silences felt like something to be endured. This one just felt like weather. But He showed them the upstairs room, the larger of the two guest rooms, with a window that faced south and caught afternoon light. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers. He'd put clean linens on the bed that morning without thinking about why, because he'd learned to make his house ready for things even when he wasn't sure what those things would be. "There's a smaller room at the end of the hall," he said. "Could put a cot in there for Clara, or she can stay with you, whichever she's more comfortable with." "With me," Evelyn said, without hesitating. Then, a beat later, "For now, at least." Cole nodded. "Kitchen's downstairs on the right. Help yourself to whatever's there. I eat early, around 5:30, if you want to join. If not, food's there whenever you need it." He started toward the door, and then Evelyn said, "Mr. Mercer." He turned. "I want to be clear about something," she said. She had a directness to her that he was already recognizing as her baseline mode. Not aggressive, just unwilling to leave things unspoken. "I am grateful for what you did today, genuinely. But I'm not going to pretend that what happened to us wasn't humiliating or that I feel nothing about it, because I do. And I'm not going to perform gratitude every morning to make you comfortable. I'll work hard. I'll keep my word. But I need to know that's enough." Cole looked at her for a moment. "That's more than enough," he said. "And for what it's worth, what happened back there should have made everyone in that crowd feel worse than it made you feel. The shame in it wasn't yours." She held his gaze. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition that the words were meant honestly. "All right," she said. He left them to settle in. The first week was careful in the way that most beginnings are. People moving around each other slowly, learning the geography of a shared space, trying not to assume anything. Cole got up at 4:30, as he always did, and had coffee made before the sun came up. Evelyn was down by 5:15 the first morning, which surprised him, and she moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years making meals in unfamiliar places. "You don't have to start so early," he said. "I don't sleep well in the last months," she said, meaning the pregnancy. "Might as well be useful." He didn't argue. Clara came down at 7, still in her nightgown, hair uncombed, and sat at the kitchen table watching Cole's border collie, a rangy, gray-muzzled dog named Brackett, with an expression of total absorption. Brackett lay under the table and thumped his tail against the floor when he felt her eyes on him. "He's old," Cole said, because the girl was clearly curious and he didn't know what else to offer. 14. Mostly deaf now, but he still thinks he runs this place. Clara looked at the dog for another long moment, then reached down very slowly and put her small hand on top of his head. Brackett closed his eyes. Something about that exchange, small as it was, sat in Cole's chest for the rest of the day. Cole Mercer was 43 years old and had been alone for 9 years. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever in the winter of 1881, and their daughter Lily, who had been 4 years old, had died 8 days later of the same illness. He didn't talk about this because there wasn't anything to say about it that didn't sound either insufficient or theatrical, and he'd long since given up trying to find the right words. He carried it the way you carry a wound that's healed over. It doesn't bleed anymore, but it changes how you move. He'd been a different kind of man before. Louder, probably. More willing to be known. 9 years of solitude had made him economical in every sense, with words, with money, with the energy it took to want things. He ran the ranch adequately, kept his accounts straight, had a few men he'd known long enough to call acquaintances, if not quite friends. He didn't drink much. He read when the nights were long. He got through. He hadn't expected company to feel the way it did. Not comforting exactly, more like the return of something he'd forgotten how to account for. The sound of someone else moving through the house in the morning. The smell of food cooked by someone other than himself. Clara's serious eyes tracking him across the kitchen. He didn't know what to do with any of it, so he did what he always did. He worked. It was 10 days in when the first letter arrived. Cole was in the barn when Evelyn came out with it, holding it by one corner like it was something she didn't want to touch more than necessary. Her face had gone the kind of blank that isn't really blank at all. "It's from Victor," she said. Cole straightened up from what he was doing. "Victor Hartwell. My husband's brother." She held out the letter. "He knows where I am." Cole took the letter and read it. It was 3 paragraphs, written in the careful, formal language of a man who'd had legal training or at least enough exposure to lawyers to know how to make threats sound polite. The substance of it was this. Victor Hartwell had reason to believe that the child Evelyn was carrying was the rightful heir to the Hartwell family estate, which had passed to Daniel Hart's surviving male kin, meaning Victor, upon Daniel's death. He intended to pursue legal custody of the unborn child upon birth. He had already consulted with attorneys in Carson City. He expected Evelyn's full cooperation. Cole read it twice, then he handed it back to her. "He can do this?" Cole asked. "He thinks he can." Evelyn folded the letter with deliberate care, like she was containing something. "Daniel's family has money and connections. Victor has spent the last 20 years making himself useful to powerful people. He knows every judge in the territory on a first-name basis." She paused. "He's been after this since Daniel died. He didn't expect me to get out of town before he could move. What does he actually want? The child or the estate?" Evelyn made a small, humorless sound. "The estate. The child is just the mechanism. If he controls the child, he controls the inheritance. If he controls the inheritance, he gets everything Daniel spent his whole life building." She stopped. Victor always resented that Daniel got the better land. Daniel was the kind of man people liked. Victor is the kind of man people are careful around. He's been planning this since the funeral. Cole turned the information over. "What's in the will?" "Daniel left everything to me and our children. The house, the land in Millhaven County, the livestock, the money in the bank." Victor contested it within a week of the burial, claiming Daniel wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it. Her voice was steady, but the knuckles of her hand around the letter were white. The Millhaven judge ruled in Victor's favor on a technicality. Something about the way the will was witnessed. That's why we lost the house. That's how the debts ended up in my name. She looked at Cole. "He already took everything once. He won't stop until he has the child too." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something pulling loose. "He knows you're here," Cole said. "How?" "I don't know. He has people everywhere." She looked at the letter once more, then at Cole. "I'm sorry. I didn't anticipate this reaching you so quickly." "You don't need to apologize to me," Cole said. She nodded once, the way someone nods when they accept a statement without fully believing it. Then she went back toward the house, and Cole stood in the barn doorway watching her go, already thinking about what came next. What came next arrived 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first real cold of the season had settled over the valley and the creek at the north edge of the property had iced over at the edges. Cole had ridden to town for supplies and came back to find a man on horseback at the edge of the property line, not quite on the ranch, not quite off it, watching the house. The man didn't move when Cole rode up. He had the flat, patient look of someone who was being paid to be there. "You're on my land," Cole said. "Just about," the man said pleasantly. He had a letter in his hand. "Mr. Mercer, I represent Victor Hartwell. I have a document here requesting that Mrs. Hart be made available for a legal conference at the county seat within the next 10 days. It's a courtesy notice." "That's not what courtesy notices look like," Cole said. The man smiled with his mouth. "Mr. Hartwell is a patient man, Mr. Mercer, but he does expect to be taken seriously. The woman on your property is subject to certain legal obligations pertaining to the Hartwell estate. He'd like to resolve this peaceably." "Give me the document," Cole said. The man handed it over. Cole read it right there on horseback. It was drafted by a law firm in Carson City, and it was designed to sound reasonable while requesting something that wasn't, specifically for Evelyn to present herself at a legal proceeding where Victor's attorneys would formally argue that the child she was carrying was property of the Hartwell estate and should be placed under court supervision at birth. Cole folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. "Tell Mr. Hartwell that Mrs. Hart will be consulting with her own legal representation and will respond in due time," Cole said. "Also tell him to keep his men off my property line. Next time, I'll treat it as trespass." The man's smile didn't change. "Of course. Good day, Mr. Mercer." He turned his horse and rode. That evening, Cole sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn and laid out what he knew. He didn't soften it. She hadn't asked him to handle her carefully, and he didn't think she'd want that. "Victor's moving faster than I expected," he said. "He has the legal machinery already in place. Carson City firm, which means he's got money behind this, and he's been planning it since before you left Millhaven. Evelyn sat with her hands folded on the table. She was 8 months along now, and the weight of the pregnancy had begun to show in the lines around her eyes, though she didn't complain about it. "What does the document say exactly?" Cole told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He wants to claim guardianship before the baby is even born. That's the mechanism, yes. Get the court to recognize the child as a Hartwell heir under his guardianship before you can establish independent legal standing. And the problem is that I don't have legal standing," Evelyn said flatly. "I'm a widow, without property. In a state where a woman's legal rights depend almost entirely on her husband's name or her family's name or some man's name attached to her." She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of how things worked. "Victor knows that. He's always known that. It's why he moved on the estate so fast after Daniel died. He knew I had no mechanism to fight back." "You had Daniel's will." "Daniel's will that a corrupt judge threw out." She looked at Cole steadily. "I know how this works, Mr. Mercer. I've watched it work on me for 6 months. The system isn't designed for women like me." Cole nodded slowly. He was looking at the table, working through something. "There's one mechanism," he said. She waited. "Marriage," Cole said. "If you were married to someone with property and legal standing in this county, Victor's argument changes entirely. The child born in wedlock is the legal child of the husband as well as the wife. Victor's custody claim falls apart, and the new husband's legal standing gives you standing to contest the original will ruling in a different jurisdiction." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the wood stove popped once. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You're suggesting you marry me?" "I'm presenting it as an option," Cole said carefully. "Not a suggestion, not a request." "There's a difference?" "I think so. An option is something you consider on your own terms. A request puts pressure on you." He met her gaze. "I don't want to put pressure on you. You've had enough of that." She was quiet, not processing exactly. He could tell she'd already understood the logic. She was doing something else, something internal, some reckoning with what it would mean to say yes to this. "You'd be taking on considerable risk," she said finally. "Victor won't accept this quietly. He'll come at you. He'll try. He has money and connections. So does his problem. It's called a legal marriage certificate in a county where I've owned property for 11 years and paid my taxes on time and never been in court for anything." Cole leaned back in his chair. "I'm not saying it solves everything. I'm saying it changes the terrain." Evelyn looked towards the window. Outside, the dark had gone full, and the cold was pressing against the glass. Clara had gone to sleep an hour ago, and the house was quiet around them, except for Brackett's breathing from his spot by the fire. "If I say yes," Evelyn said slowly, "I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. I'm not going to be a wife who makes herself small to make you comfortable. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'll say them. I'm not going to be grateful enough to stop thinking for myself." "I wouldn't know what to do with that anyway," Cole said. "I've lived alone too long." Something moved across her face that might, in another context, have been the beginning of something lighter. But the circumstances were what they were. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. "A different set of problems than the ones I have now," Cole said, "which frankly isn't a bad trade." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, yes." They rode to the county clerk's office the next morning. Just the two of them, Clara staying with the nearest neighbor woman, a widow named Mrs. Foss, who lived 3 miles south and seemed largely incurious about other people's business. The county clerk, a reedy man named Aldous Bell, looked at them over his spectacles with the expression of a man who'd seen most things and didn't intend to be surprised by any of them. "You want to file a marriage license," Aldous said, "and have the ceremony today," Cole said. "If the justice of the peace is available." Aldous looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him without flinching. "He's available," Aldous said, and went to get the paperwork. The ceremony was 4 minutes long. The justice of the peace, a heavy-set man named Randolph Utter, read the words in the tired way of someone who'd said them so many times they'd lost their texture. Cole said yes when he was supposed to. Evelyn said yes when she was supposed to. Randolph Utter said they were married under the laws of the state, and that was that. Aldous Bell signed the certificate. Cole and Evelyn signed it. Aldous filed it in the record book with a date and a case number. On the ride home, Evelyn said, "That was the least romantic thing I have ever done." "Second least for me," Cole said. She looked at him. "What was the first?" "Castrating calves." She looked at him for another second, and then she made a sound, short and sharp and real, that might have been the first time she'd laughed since before Daniel died. Cole didn't say anything about it. He just kept the horse at its steady pace and let the cold air move around them, and thought that the ground had shifted under everything, and he wasn't entirely sure where they were standing now. But at least they were standing. The marriage certificate was filed under the name Evelyn Mercer. The county records updated quietly, the way official things do, with no audience and no ceremony beyond a clerk's pen. Victor Hartwell, 8 miles away in whatever rented room he was using as a base of operations, didn't know about it yet. He would. What? That evening, Cole sat on the porch after supper. The stars were clear and very cold, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing. He could hear from inside the low murmur of Evelyn reading to Clara, a habit she kept up every night, whether or not Clara responded, which she didn't. Just the sound of her mother's voice moving through a story in the warm room. Cole sat with his hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold and thought about Margaret. Not with the sharp, specific grief of the early years, that had dulled to something more like an ache that you learn to live around. He thought about her the way he sometimes did, just acknowledging that she had been real and that he had loved her and that she was gone, and that the fact of her absence had shaped every year since into something he hadn't planned for. He wasn't sure what he thought about what he'd done today. It had seemed like the logical thing, the practical solution to a real problem, and he was a man who responded well to practical solutions. But practical solutions had a way of becoming real things, and real things had weight, and he was aware that he'd just added considerable weight to his life. From inside, Clara's voice, high, sudden, one word, more. A pause. Then Evelyn's voice, quiet and careful and shaking just slightly at the edges. "Okay, sweetheart, I'll read more." Cole sat very still on the porch in the cold dark. He thought maybe that one word from that little girl was the most significant thing that had happened in this house in a long time. He didn't go inside. He just sat and let the night be what it was, while inside the house the reading went on, and the fire made its small sound, and the world continued to be complicated and imperfect, and strangely, stubbornly worth something. The word traveled faster than Cole had expected. He found out about it on Thursday, 4 days after the marriage certificate was filed, when he rode into Caldera Crossing for lumber and discovered that 3 separate men had things to say to him before he'd even tied his horse. The feed store owner, a broad, cautious man named Aldred Sims, was first. He pulled Cole aside near the entrance and said, in a low voice that suggested he was doing Cole a favor, that a man from out of county had been asking questions about him, specifically about the Mercer Ranch, its acreage, its debt status, and whether Cole had any legal disputes on record. "Who was the man?" Cole asked. "Didn't give his name, dressed well. Came in with somebody who identified himself as an attorney out of Carson City." Cole thanked him and moved on. The barber, when Cole passed his shop window, came out to the sidewalk to say that the same 2 men had been in asking about Cole's late wife. When she died, how she died, whether there had been any children. And the postmaster, a woman named Helen Greer, who missed nothing and said everything, stopped Cole on his way to the lumberyard to say that a letter had arrived at the post office addressed to Evelyn Hart, not Evelyn Mercer, from a law firm in Carson City, and that the man who'd delivered it personally had been very interested in knowing whether Evelyn was still on the Mercer property. "I told him I didn't track where people lived," Helen said, "because it wasn't his business and because I didn't like his face." "Appreciate it," Cole said. "Victor Hartwell's people," Helen said flatly. It wasn't a question. Helen Greer had been the postmaster in Caldera Crossing for 19 years, and she maintained a mental map of every family's business in the county. He ran that same operation on a woman in Portsmouth 2 years ago, widow with an inheritance, buried her in legal proceedings until she gave up and signed everything over. She looked at Cole steadily. "You know what you're getting into." "Getting clearer on it every day," Cole said. He loaded his lumber and rode home. He told Evelyn that evening straight out, the way he'd learned she preferred. No cushioning, no careful construction of the facts to make them less alarming. She listened with her hands around a cup of tea, seated at the kitchen table, And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way she went quiet when she was thinking rather than feeling. He's building a profile, she said. On both of us, it sounds like. He'll look for anything. A debt, a legal irregularity. If your marriage to me can be challenged on any grounds, if there's any question about capacity or coercion or timing, he'll use it. She turned the cup in her hands. He did the same thing with Daniel's will. Found one witness who'd moved out of state and convinced the judge that the witnessing was improperly conducted. One small thing, and the whole document collapsed. The marriage is solid, Cole said, filed clean in this county by a licensed justice of the peace. I've owned this property for 11 years without a legal dispute. There's nothing there to pull. There doesn't have to be something real. There just has to be something he can make look questionable long enough to get a friendly judge to act on. She looked at him. Victor is very good at creating delay. Delay works in his favor because I'm 8 months pregnant. If he can tie things up long enough for the baby to be born before I have legal protection established. She stopped. Then he applies for emergency custody at birth, Cole finished, before we can respond. Yes, they sat with that for a moment. Brackett shifted under the table, some dream moving through him, his legs twitching briefly before he settled again. We need legal help, Cole said. Real legal help. Not Purcell. Purcell would fall over if Victor's people looked at him sideways, Evelyn agreed. Is there anyone in this county you trust? Cole thought about it. There's a man named Asa Drummond, lawyer out of Sutterton, about 20 miles east. He's been practicing here for 30 years. Took on the railroad over water rights 3 years ago and won. He doesn't owe Victor anything, and he's got enough of his own reputation that money doesn't impress him. Can you get to him? I can ride out tomorrow. Evelyn nodded. Then she said, I want to come. Cole looked at her. I know, she said with a slight edge. I'm 8 months along and riding 20 miles is not ideal. But Drummond needs to hear it from me. He needs to see me, talk to me, understand that I'm not some helpless woman who needs to be explained. If he's going to represent my interests, he needs to know what my interests actually are. She met Cole's eyes. Don't manage me on this. I wasn't going to, Cole said. Though he had been considering it, he had the self-awareness to admit that, at least to himself. You were, she said, with something that wasn't quite a smile. I can tell. You get this look. What look? Like you're deciding what to carry for me. I've had men do that my whole life. Decide what I can handle, and then handle the rest without asking. She set down the cup. I know you mean well by it, but I need you to ask first. Cole was quiet for a moment. All right. Do you want to ride to Sutterton tomorrow? Yes, she said. Thank you. It's in. They left at first light, with Clara in the wagon between them, bundled against the cold in a coat that was slightly too large because it had been the smallest one Cole could find in town. The road to Sutterton was better maintained than the North Road. More traffic, more commerce, a stage route that kept the ruts from getting too bad. Even so, Cole kept the horse at a careful pace, and the wagon moved slowly through the thin morning light. Clara had a way of watching the road ahead with the same intense concentration she applied to everything. She'd been doing better in small ways that Cole tracked without mentioning. She came to breakfast faster in the mornings. She'd started sitting closer to Brackett on the floor, instead of just near him. She'd said 3 more words in the 9 days since the night she'd asked for more of the story. The words were yes, no, and on one occasion, cold, when Evelyn had left a window open too long. It wasn't conversation, but it was something. She was watching the road, and then she looked up at Cole and held up her index finger. Cole looked at her. One what? She pointed at the sky to the left of the road. Cole followed her finger and found a hawk, high and banking slow in the pale sky. Just one today, he agreed. Yesterday there were 3. Clara nodded seriously and went back to watching the road. Cole glanced at Evelyn. She was looking straight ahead, but there was something in the set of her jaw that he recognized now as the face she made when something had moved her, and she didn't want to show it in front of anyone. Asa Drummond's office in Sutterton was above a hardware store, accessible by an outside staircase that had been built with optimism and maintained with indifference. Inside it was cramped and warm and smelled of paper and tobacco, with stacks of files on every flat surface, and a window that looked out over the main street at an angle that suggested the building had settled unevenly over the decades. Drummond himself was 60-something, compact, with a beard that had gone fully white and eyes that moved quickly when you talked, and slowly when he was thinking. He listened to Cole for 3 minutes and then held up a hand. "Let me hear it from Mrs." He checked the paper he'd written on. "Mrs. Mercer." Evelyn told him everything from the beginning. She was precise and organized, delivering the facts in the order they'd happened, not the order that made her look most sympathetic. Cole noticed this. She didn't soft-pedal Daniel's debts or the state of things when he died, didn't frame herself as purely innocent of any financial complication. She just said what had happened, what Victor had done, what the Millhaven judge had ruled, and what she expected Victor to attempt next. Drummond listened without interrupting, making occasional small marks on his paper. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Hartwell," he said, to the ceiling. "I've heard that name. Not in court. Around court. He's got people on retainer in at least 3 jurisdictions. Carson City is right. Expendable money and a long patience." He brought his gaze back down. "The marriage helps. It changes the legal standing significantly, and the timing, done before the birth, is important. What it doesn't do is resolve the original will dispute." "The Millhaven ruling," Evelyn said. "Yes. If that ruling stands, it establishes Victor's claim to the estate assets, which he'll argue includes any inheritance rights the child might have. The marriage protects the child's custody, but it doesn't automatically restore what was taken from the estate." He tapped his pen on the desk. "Do you have copies of Daniel's original will?" "I have a copy. I've had it since Daniel wrote it." Drummond looked at her. "How did you keep it, given that Victor took the property?" "I kept it on my person," she said simply. "I put it in my corset the day Daniel died, and I haven't trusted it to a box or a drawer since." Drummond's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted toward respect. "The witnesses to the will, do you know where they are?" "One died last year. The other is a woman named Ruth Caldwell. She moved to Elko after her husband took a job with the mining company, but she was there when Daniel signed. She signed the paper herself." "And the Millhaven judge's claim was that the witnessing was improper? That one of the witnesses had since moved out of state and was therefore unavailable to confirm the signing?" Evelyn's voice was steady, which was convenient, since Victor had spent 2 months before the ruling ensuring that any witnesses who might contradict him were either gone or had reason to be quiet. Drummond wrote something. "Mrs. Mercer, if Ruth Caldwell can be located and will provide a sworn affidavit confirming her witnessing of that will, the Millhaven ruling can be challenged in a different court. The ruling wasn't on the merit of the will. It was on a procedural question. New evidence from the surviving witness changes the procedural question." He paused. "It's not simple. It requires filing in the right jurisdiction, with a judge who isn't already in Hartwell's pocket. But it's the thread." "Can you find that judge?" Cole asked. Drummond looked at him. "I know a man named Elias Coburn, district judge based out of Reno. He's not the type to be bought, and he's had personal reason to dislike men who use legal procedures as weapons." He paused. "He's also not easy. He doesn't take cases he thinks are fishing expeditions. You'd need the affidavit from the Caldwell woman, and you'd need it to be solid." "Then we find Ruth Caldwell," Evelyn said. "It's not a fast process," Drummond said, with the careful honesty of a man who'd watched too many people be surprised by how slow the law moved. "Victor will file his claims the moment the baby is born, if not before. You may be dealing with active court pressure before we have the counter-evidence ready." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "Do you have money for representation?" Drummond asked. Cole recognized the directness of it, the question that lawyers sometimes dance around and sometimes just ask. "I have land," Cole said, "and the winter cattle sale is in 6 weeks." Drummond nodded. "Come back to me with that affidavit, or a serious lead on where to get it. In the meantime, I'll file a protective motion on behalf of the child. Not to counter Victor's claim yet, just to put your legal standing on record before he does." He looked at both of them. "Don't wait for him to make the first move in court. Be on the record first." They were a mile out of Sutterton on the return ride when Cole said, "Ruth Caldwell, Elko." "It's 3 days by horse," Evelyn said. "Maybe 2.5 with a good animal and good weather." She paused. "I can't make the ride myself, not now." "No," Cole agreed, "but someone needs to." Cole turned this over. He had cattle to manage and a fence line that was getting worse, and a ranch that didn't run itself. He also had a pregnant woman in her 8th month and a child who was only just beginning to find her way back to words. And leaving both of them at the ranch with Victor's people already sniffing around the property line felt wrong in a way he couldn't exactly argue with logically. "I know a man," he said. "Tom Eller. He worked this ranch 3 summers ago. Good, solid man. He's been doing day labor out of Caldera Crossing since the fall. I can hire him to watch the place while I ride to Elko." Evelyn looked at him. "How long would you be gone?" 6, 7 days, depending on whether Caldwell is cooperative. She was quiet for a moment. Clara, between them, had fallen asleep against her mother's arm. "I don't like it," Evelyn said finally. "But I understand it." A pause. "Be careful. Victor's people have been watching the property. If they see you leave, then they'll think I've gone for supplies or cattle business. There's nothing unusual about a rancher riding to Elko." Cole looked at her. "You'll be all right here." "I know I will," she said, and there was something in it that wasn't reassurance-seeking, just a statement of fact about herself. "I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about—" She stopped. "What?" "I don't know what Victor will do when he finds out about the marriage. He's patient, but he's not passive. Finding out that his legal strategy has been disrupted will make him angry, and angry men with money and lawyers make unpredictable moves." She looked at Cole. "Be ready for that when you get back." Cole said he would be. He rode out 2 days later, before dawn, after leaving detailed instructions with Tom Eller about what to watch for and what to do if anything happened. Tom was 34, steady, with the particular competence of a man who'd worked ranches his whole life and understood that things go wrong and you deal with them. Cole trusted him as much as he trusted most people, which was not unconditionally, but enough. The ride to Elko was hard. The weather turned on the 2nd day. Not snow yet, but a cold driving rain that made the road difficult and the nights brutal. Cole had a good horse and adequate gear, and he covered the distance in 2.5 days, arriving in Elko in the early afternoon of the 3rd day, looking like something that had been dragged behind a wagon. He found Ruth Caldwell through the mining company's employee records, which a board clerk let him look at for 50 cents. She lived on the east side of town with her husband and 2 children, in a small, tidy house with a vegetable garden that had already been put to bed for winter. Cole knocked on the door, and a woman opened it. Mid-40s, brown hair going gray, with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned to assess strangers quickly. "Mrs. Caldwell?" "Yes." "My name is Cole Mercer. I'm here about Evelyn Hart. She's my wife now. I need to talk to you about a document you witnessed." Ruth Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You'd better come in." She knew immediately what he was talking about. She'd known Daniel Hart for 15 years. They'd been neighbors in Millhaven, her family and his, before the Caldwells moved east. She'd been there the afternoon Daniel wrote his final will, 3 months before he died, when he'd already been sick long enough to know the shape of things. She'd watched him sign it, and she'd signed it herself. This had a man named Joseph Ferry who'd died the following January of a heart complaint. "Victor came to see me," she said, sitting across from Cole at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "About 6 weeks after Daniel died. He was very polite, very concerned about my well-being and my husband's employment and whether the mining company treated us fairly." She looked at her hands. "He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. I understood the conversation." "And you moved to Elko," Cole said. "My husband got an offer," she paused. "A very well-timed offer." The silence between them carried everything that needed to be said about how that offer had come about. "Mrs. Caldwell," Cole said, "Victor Hartwell is trying to claim custody of Evelyn's unborn child. He's going to use the Millhaven ruling, the one that threw out Daniel's will, as the legal foundation. If that ruling stands, he has a path. If someone can testify to the proper witnessing of that will, the ruling can be challenged." He looked at her. "You were there. You saw Daniel sign it. You know it was done correctly." Ruth Caldwell looked at her coffee cup. "I know what I know," she said. "I'm asking you to say it in writing, a sworn affidavit, witnessed by an attorney, that's all." "That's not all," she said quietly. "If I do that, Victor Hartwell knows exactly where I am and exactly what I've done." She looked up. "He doesn't forget things like that." "No," Cole said. "He doesn't. He didn't offer her false comfort about it, because she was right, and she deserved honesty. What I can tell you is that there's a judge in Reno, Elias Coburn, who has the authority to handle this outside Victor's usual jurisdictions. If the affidavit is part of a case before Coburn, Victor's ability to retaliate through legal channels is significantly reduced. He paused. I can't promise you he won't find other channels. I can promise you that Evelyn Hart is 8 months pregnant with her late husband's child, that she lost her home and everything her husband built, and that she came very close to being sold at public auction for $200. Boshem. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, one of the Caldwell children said something, and another one answered, and then it was quiet again. She really was auctioned? Ruth said. I was there. I bought the debt to stop it. Ruth looked at him for a long time. He didn't push it. He'd said what there was to say, and the rest was hers to work through. Let me talk to my husband, she said finally. Cole nodded. I'll be at the hotel on the main street. I'll wait 3 days. She came to him the next morning, without her husband, which told Cole something about how that conversation had gone. She had a look on her face like someone who'd made a decision and was committed to it even if she wasn't entirely comfortable with it, which was about the most honest version of courage Cole knew. I'll give you the affidavit, she said. There's an attorney in town, a woman actually, one of the few I've met, named Petra Vance. I trust her. She can witness it. That's good enough, Cole said. Petra Vance turned out to be a sharp-faced woman of about 50 who operated out of an office that was half the size of Drummond's and twice as organized, and she asked Ruth 3 careful questions before she agreed to witness the document, which Cole recognized as the approach of a lawyer who didn't want her name on anything she hadn't verified. Ruth answered all 3 questions steadily and without hesitation. The affidavit was written, sworn, signed, and notarized by noon. Cole folded the document inside his coat, in the same place where a woman had once kept her husband's will against her body, and rode back toward Caldera Crossing. He made it back in 3 days, pushing harder than the ride out, with the weather drying and the road better and a feeling at the back of his neck that he needed to be home. He was right to push. Tom Eller met him at the barn door before he'd fully dismounted, with the contained urgency of a man who has news and knows that how he delivers it matters. 2 things, Tom said. Victor Hartwell's lawyer was here 2 days ago, in person, asked for Evelyn by her old name. I told him she wasn't available and that he should put anything he needed to say in writing to Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. How did he take that? Quietly. Too quietly. Tom looked at Cole steadily. The other thing is that Evelyn started having contractions yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Foss is with her. Dr. Hensley rode out from town this morning. He says it's early, but it's happening. Cole moved past him toward the house. The doctor met him at the top of the stairs, a compact man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who'd been present at enough births to know which ones to worry about and which ones to trust to their own momentum. She's doing well, he said, before Cole could ask. It's early, a few weeks early, but not dangerously so. The baby's positioned correctly. She's strong. He looked at Cole. This could go another few hours, or it could be morning. You should prepare yourself to wait. Is she asking for anything? She asked for Clara to be kept calm. She said Clara would know something was happening and that somebody should stay with her. Cole went downstairs. Clara was in the kitchen with Mrs. Foss, sitting at the table with Brackett's head in her lap, her face the particular controlled blankness she wore when she was frightened and trying not to show it. She was 9 years old doing the work of someone twice that, and it sat in Cole's chest like a stone. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Your mama is okay, he said. The baby's coming early, but the doctor says she's doing well. Clara looked at him. Her hands were very still on top of Brackett's ears. It might take a while, Cole said, so we're going to sit here together and wait. All right? Clara looked at him for a long moment, then she said, You came back. 3 words, addressed to him. Cole felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for and wasn't sure he needed one. I came back, he said. I said I would. Clara nodded slowly, as if she was filing that information somewhere careful and important. Then she looked back down at Brackett, and her hands began moving again, slow and steady, through the old dog's fur. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of the first real snow of the season. Inside, the house held its warmth and its waiting, and Cole sat at the kitchen table through the long evening with a child and an old dog, and the distant sound of the doctor moving upstairs, and thought about the document folded inside his coat and what it was going to mean when Victor Hartwell finally showed up. Because he would show up, and soon, and the ground they were standing on now was different from the ground they'd been standing on a week ago. But different wasn't the same as safe. It was not a peaceful night, but it was one they got through. The baby came at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. Cole heard it, or rather, he heard the silence that came just before, and then a sound that wasn't crying exactly, more like a declaration, sharp and indignant, from something that had just discovered the world was considerably colder and louder than wherever it had been before. He was at the kitchen table, where he'd been sitting for most of the night, and he stood up so fast he knocked his coffee cup sideways. Brackett raised his head. Clara, who had fallen asleep in the chair across from him with her cheek on her folded arms, didn't stir. He waited at the bottom of the stairs. Mrs. Foss came down 10 minutes later with a look on her face that was tired and satisfied in equal measure. Girl, she said. Small, but she's got a voice on her. Doctor says both of them are fine. Cole sat back down at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment. He wasn't sure what he felt exactly. Relief was the largest part of it, but there was something else underneath that he didn't examine closely. Can she have visitors? He asked. In an hour. Let the doctor finish. He waited the hour. Clara woke up on her own at around 5, in that disoriented way of children who've fallen asleep somewhere they didn't intend to, and looked around the kitchen with wide eyes until she located Cole and settled. Is Mama okay? She asked. She's fine, Cole said. You have a sister. Clara looked at him. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, a child working through more than she could probably put into language. Then she said, very quietly, Can I see her? In a little while, Cole said. The little while passed slowly. When Dr. Hensley finally came downstairs and said they could go up, Clara walked ahead of Cole without waiting for permission, which was exactly right. Evelyn looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who has done something genuinely hard, not dramatic exhaustion, not theatrical, just the real kind, where the eyes are heavy and the skin has gone the color of old paper and every movement is deliberate because nothing is easy. She was propped up against the headboard with the baby wrapped in a blanket Cole had found in the cedar chest, and she looked up when Clara came through the door with an expression that rearranged every tired line in her face into something else entirely. Clara climbed up onto the bed without asking and pressed herself against her mother's side and looked at the baby with the same focused attention she gave everything. She's very small, she said. She is, Evelyn said. Is she going to stay small? No, she'll get bigger. Clara considered this. Then she reached out one finger and touched the baby's closed fist, very carefully, and the baby's fingers moved and Clara made a sound, small, involuntary, that was the closest thing to delight Cole had heard from her yet. Cole stood in the doorway. He hadn't come all the way in. He wasn't sure if the room wanted him in it or not, and he'd learned to be careful about that kind of thing, the rooms that belonged to other people's moments. Evelyn looked at him over Clara's head. Come in, she said. You don't have to hover. He came in and stood at the foot of the bed. The baby was awake, or mostly awake, blinking with the unfocused concentration of something that had not yet decided what the world was. She has a name? Cole asked. May, Evelyn said. After Daniel's mother. She paused. Is that all right with you? He wasn't sure why she was asking him. Then he was, because the baby was legally a Mercer now. May Mercer on the birth certificate that Dr. Hensley would file, which was the whole point, the shield they'd built, the thing that changed the battlefield. The name was Evelyn's choice in every real sense, but the legal name belonged to both of them. May is a good name, Cole said. Evelyn nodded. She looked back down at the baby, and something in her expression shifted into a territory Cole recognized because he'd been there himself once, a long time ago. That particular vertigo of loving something new that you know you'd do anything to protect. He left them to it and went downstairs to start breakfast. because somebody had to. Parsam. Victor Hartwell arrived 9 days later. Cole saw the wagon coming up the north road from the front porch, where he'd made a habit of sitting in the early morning since May was born, with his coffee and the particular quiet of a house that now had more people in it than it used to. It was a good wagon, expensive, with matched horses, the kind of equipage that announced money without trying to hide it. There were 2 men riding alongside it on horseback, and a 4th man driving. Cole recognized the man who climbed down from the wagon seat before he was all the way to the porch. Not because he'd met him, but because he'd formed a picture from everything Evelyn had described, and the picture was accurate. Victor Hartwell was 50 or thereabouts, built like a man who'd been fit once and let it go soft in the middle, but kept the impression of it in the way he carried himself. He was dressed well, too well for a ranch call, which Cole suspected was intentional. He had a face that had probably been charming at some point, and had since become the performance of charm, the motions without the warmth. He walked up to the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, which was either courtesy or tactics, probably both. "Mr. Mercer," he said. His voice was smooth. "I'm Victor Hartwell. I believe you're acquainted with my situation." "I'm acquainted with your interest in my wife's child," Cole said, "which is not the same as your situation." Victor smiled with the part of his face that was above the jaw. "Of course. I apologize if that sounded presumptuous." He looked at the house. "Is Evelyn available?" "She's feeding the baby. Perhaps in a few minutes then. I've ridden some distance and I'd appreciate the chance to speak with her." "You can speak with me," Cole said. "Whatever you have to say to Evelyn, you can say to her husband." The smile stayed in place. "I've heard about the marriage, yes. Quite sudden. Marriages sometimes are." Victor looked at him with an assessing quality that he didn't bother to conceal. "Mr. Mercer, I want you to understand that I have no personal quarrel with you. You did a kind thing taking Evelyn in, but this matter predates your involvement. It's a family issue, a question of inheritance and proper stewardship of what Daniel built. Surely you can see that an outsider's involvement, however well-intentioned—" "I'm not an outsider," Cole said. "I'm her husband. Under the law of this state, that makes everything concerning her and her children my business." A pause. Victor studied him. "You understand that the marriage doesn't resolve the estate question." "I understand that's your position." "It's also the position of the Carson City Court, which is already—" "That ruling is being challenged," Cole said, "in a different jurisdiction, by a different judge, with evidence that wasn't presented in Millhaven." He watched Victor's face and saw something move through it. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalibration of a man who has walked into a room expecting one arrangement of furniture and found another. It was quick, and Victor covered it well, but Cole had been watching for it. "Evidence," Victor said. "A sworn affidavit from Ruth Caldwell, witnessed and notarized in Elko, filed with Asa Drummond's office in Sutterton as of this week." Cole said it the way he might mention the weather. Factual, unhurried. "You remember Ruth Caldwell. She witnessed Daniel's will, the one the Millhaven judge said was improperly witnessed." The smile had changed. Still there, but thinner. "Ruth Caldwell is not— She's in Elko with her husband. She's been there about a year. She was very clear about what she witnessed and when." Cole set down his coffee cup on the porch railing. "You should know that Drummond has already made contact with Judge Elias Coburn's office in Reno. Coburn's clerk has confirmed that he'll review the filing." Victor was very still for a moment. The 2 men on horseback behind him exchanged a glance that they thought was subtle and wasn't. "Coburn," Victor said. "You know him?" "I know of him." Victor's voice had lost something. Not composure exactly, but a layer of the ease that had been wrapped around it. "This is a more complicated situation than I anticipated." "It's going to get more complicated," Cole said. "I'd suggest you talk to your attorneys before you do anything else. Specifically, I'd suggest you ask them how a custody claim holds up when the mother is legally married, the birth certificate names the child as a legitimate Mercer, and the estate ruling your entire argument rests on is currently before a district judge in Reno." He looked at Victor steadily. "But that's between you and your lawyers." Victor stood at the base of the porch steps for a moment. He had the look of a man working very hard to seem unbothered by something that was bothering him significantly. "I'd still like to speak with Evelyn," he said. "She's feeding the baby," Cole said again. and she has nothing to say to you that isn't better said through attorneys. Another pause. Then Victor said, "You're making an enemy, Mr. Mercer." "I've been managing an enemy since before you rode up," Cole said. "Good day, Mr. Hartwell." He told Evelyn about it that afternoon, word for word, while she sat in the kitchen chair with May in the crook of her arm, and Clara doing something with yarn at the table. Evelyn listened without interrupting, and when Cole finished, she said nothing for a moment, looking at the baby's face. "How did he take the Coburn information?" she asked. "It landed," Cole said. "He covered it, but it landed. Good." She shifted May slightly. "Victor has spent years understanding exactly which judges can be reached and which can't. Coburn is on the short list of the ones who can't, which is why Victor hasn't operated in Reno before. Hearing that name will have made him genuinely nervous." A pause. "Which means he'll move faster." "I know. He's not going to walk away. I want to be clear about that. What happened on the porch today wasn't a retreat. It was a reassessment. He's going to come back with something different." "What does he have left?" Cole asked. Evelyn looked at the table. "He can attack the marriage, try to have it voided on grounds of coercion or fraud, claim that I was in a vulnerable position and you took advantage of it, or that the marriage was specifically designed to obstruct a legal proceeding, which it was, though that's not automatically illegal." She ticked them off with the methodical quality of someone who'd been thinking through this for days. "He can try to locate financial or legal problems in your history, anything that would damage your standing as the husband. He can try to discredit Ruth Caldwell, claim she's unreliable, that her testimony was purchased or coerced." She looked up at Cole. "And he can try to go directly after May." "Meaning?" "Meaning he questions the parentage." She said it flatly. "Claims the child isn't Daniel's. If he can plant enough doubt about that, the inheritance argument changes shape. The child loses the Hartwell claim, which means I lose the main reason a court would prioritize my rights over his." Cole looked at her. "Can he do that?" "He can try. It requires demonstrating opportunity and making people believe the worst, which costs him something socially, but nothing legally if the claim goes nowhere." She looked back at May. "He did it to another woman in Portsmouth. Mrs. Foss told me about it on the second day I was here. He questioned the legitimacy of her child in court filings. The court dismissed it, but the damage was done. The woman was so humiliated she eventually signed over the estate just to stop the proceedings." "You're not going to do that," Cole said. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not." There was no drama in it, just a statement of where she stood. Cole sat down across from her. Clara at the table had stopped doing things with yarn and was listening with the careful, invisible attention of a child who knows the adults are talking about something serious and is tracking every word. "Drummond needs to file the protective motion now," Cole said, "before Victor talks to his lawyers and decides on his next step. Drummond said he'd file as soon as we had the affidavit. Then we need to ride to Sutterton." "You just had a baby 9 days ago." "I know that," Evelyn said, with a look that acknowledged the point without conceding the argument. "I also know that if Victor gets to court before we do, we spend the next 6 months reacting instead of acting, and every day we react is a day May is at risk." She held his gaze. "I can ride in a wagon. It's not a comfortable ride, and I'll feel every rut in the road, but I can do it." Cole looked at her, then at May, then at Clara, who was watching him with those serious, tracking eyes. "We go tomorrow," he said. Drummond filed the protective motion on a Thursday. He did it with the deliberate efficiency of a man who'd been waiting for the affidavit to arrive and had the rest of the paperwork already prepared. He explained the motion to Cole and Evelyn in his cluttered office above the hardware store. It established on the record that May Mercer, born to Evelyn Mercer née Hart, was the legitimate child of the marriage, that Evelyn had full parental rights, and that any claim against those rights by a third party would need to be argued before a court with proper jurisdiction, not Carson City, where Victor's lawyers operated most comfortably. "Does this stop him?" Evelyn asked. "It doesn't stop him," Drummond said. "What it does is force him to engage on ground that isn't his. He's used to operating in Carson City and Mill Haven because he's spent years building relationships there. A filing in Sutterton, connected to a proceeding before Coburn in Reno, is outside his infrastructure." He looked at them both over his papers. "I've heard from Coburn's clerk. He's agreed to review the Caldwell affidavit and the original Millhaven ruling. That's not a guarantee of anything, but it's a door open." "A speed is unshut in," What does he need from us? Cole asked. Everything you have on the original estate, Daniel's financial records, the original will, any correspondence that shows the state of Daniel's mind when he wrote it. Anything that demonstrates this wasn't a document produced by a man who wasn't competent. Drummond paused. And patience. Coburn is thorough. This will take weeks, possibly months. Victor won't wait months, Evelyn said. No, which is why I've also sent a letter to the state attorney's office outlining what we know about the Millhaven ruling and the manner in which Victor ensured the witness was unavailable. Drummond looked at her steadily. If Victor or anyone in his employ actively suppressed testimony in the original proceeding, that's a different category of problem for him. I want that on record. Evelyn sat very still. You think he'll be charged with something? I think the letter will make him aware that we're not only fighting his claims, we're examining how his claims were built. Drummond folded his hands on the desk. A man who's been operating in legal gray areas for years does not enjoy having a state attorney looking at his methods. It changes his calculation. What Cole had not anticipated was the newspaper. He found out about it on the Saturday after the Sutterton filing when Helen Greer stopped him outside the post office with a copy of the Caldera Crossing Gazette folded back to the second page. There was a short piece, 4 paragraphs, under a headline that read, Disputed Child at Center of Hartwell Estate Claim. It didn't name names outright, referring instead to a recent marriage of convenience and questions surrounding the legitimacy of a child born to a widow under disputed circumstances. But Caldera Crossing was small enough that anyone who read it would know exactly who was being described. Cole read it twice and handed it back to Helen. Victor's doing, she said. Either Victor or someone he paid, Cole said. Same thing. People are talking, Helen said with the directness of someone who thought he should know. Not everyone, but some. There are people in this town who knew your wife before you did, knew her as Daniel Hart's widow, and they're not sure what to make of this. She looked at him carefully. I'm telling you because you need to know what you're walking into, not because I think they're right. Cole nodded. What are people saying specifically? That the marriage was too fast, that a woman in her condition marrying a man she'd known 2 weeks is peculiar. A pause. And that if a man with money and lawyers says the baby's parentage is in question, people who don't know better might wonder. Cole looked at the street. The Saturday morning crowd was moving around them. People he mostly recognized. People who would form opinions based on what landed in front of them. He thought about Evelyn in the farmhouse with May and Clara, not knowing about the newspaper piece yet, and felt a particular kind of anger. Not hot, just steady and grinding, the kind that doesn't go away quickly. Victor told me I was making an enemy, Cole said. Seems like he was already yours, Helen said. Cole bought his supplies and went home and told Evelyn about the newspaper piece at the kitchen table that evening, while Clara was upstairs and May was asleep in the cradle Cole had found in the barn and repaired, piece by piece, over the past 2 weeks without saying anything to anyone about it. Evelyn listened. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. He's trying to isolate us, she said. If the town turns against us, we lose the community support that makes a local legal fight viable. We become a scandal instead of a case. She pressed her lips together. He's done this before. He's very good at it. We don't need the whole town, Cole said. We need Drummond and Coburn. We need the whole town not to actively work against us. A hostile community makes everything harder. Witnesses who don't want to be seen cooperating, a judge who gets letters from local prominent citizens suggesting he rule a certain way. She looked at him. Victor will be cultivating those prominent citizens right now. Dinners, favors, the suggestion that he's a man of property and standing trying to look after his late brother's estate against a questionable arrangement. Cole thought about this. Then we have to get there first. How? Same way he's doing it. Presence. Let people see what's actually here. He looked at her. You've been on this ranch since October. You haven't been in town much. I was 8 months pregnant, and then I had a newborn. I know, I'm not criticizing. I'm saying that you're an abstraction to most of this town. They know what Victor's people have told them and what the newspaper printed. They don't know you. Cole leaned back in his chair. They should. Evelyn looked at him with a complicated expression. You want me to be seen? I want people to know who they're forming opinions about. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not wrong?" A pause. "I hate it, but it's not wrong." "I know," Cole said.
The
The following week, Evelyn came into town on 2 occasions. The first was to the seamstress shop, where she needed fabric for May, and the second was to the general store, where she needed nothing in particular but walked slowly through the aisles with May against her chest in a wrap and Clara at her side, speaking with the women she encountered in the careful, direct way she had, not performing warmth but not withholding it either. Cole walked with her and said little, because this wasn't his work to do. He was just weight on the scale. People watched. Some turned away. Some spoke, cautiously at first, then with more ease when Evelyn answered without defensiveness or explanation, just person to person. Helen Greer introduced her to 2 women she didn't know. The seamstress, a Mrs. Ander, held May for 5 minutes while Evelyn looked at fabric and told her, in the manner of a woman who had decided something, that the newspaper piece had been badly sourced and that she personally found Mr. Hartwell's methods distasteful. It wasn't a tide turning. It was 2 women in a fabric shop. But it was something. Us. Victor's next move came on a Wednesday, 11 days after the porch confrontation, and it was not what Cole had expected. It was not another letter, not another messenger, not another piece in the newspaper. It was Victor himself, arriving at the county clerk's office in Caldera Crossing with his Carson City attorneys and filing a formal motion challenging the validity of the Mercer marriage on grounds that it had been conducted under circumstances of legal duress, specifically that Cole Mercer, having paid Evelyn's debts and thereby placed her in a position of financial obligation, had leveraged that obligation to compel a marriage that served his legal interests rather than hers. Aldous Bell, the county clerk, sent word to Cole through Helen Greer, who had a network of information movement that would have impressed a military general. Cole was at Drummond's office in Sutterton within 4 hours. Drummond read the motion. He read it again. Then he set it down on his desk and said, "This is a stretch. It's a real stretch." "Can he make it work?" Cole asked. "He can make it go to a hearing. Making it work is harder." Drummond leaned forward. "The motion rests on the claim that you were in a position of financial power over Evelyn and that she had no genuine free choice. To support that, he'd have to demonstrate that the debt payment created a coercive relationship, which means proving she had no other options, that she was dependent on your continued goodwill for basic survival." He paused. "Which she was, to some extent, objectively. She chose to come to the ranch," Cole said. "I offered. She accepted." There were witnesses to the offer, Cole thought. The feed store. "I spoke to her in front of my horse in a public street. Nobody was standing directly next to us, but it wasn't a private conversation. More importantly, was there anything in writing? Any document from that day that establishes the terms you described to her?" Cole thought again. Then he said, "Purcell. Gerald Purcell handled the debt settlement. He has records of the transaction. The terms were simple. I paid the debt, and the legal obligation was discharged. There was no contract between me and Evelyn." Drummond wrote something. Purcell's records, if they show exactly what you describe, are actually helpful here. The debt was paid. Evelyn was legally free. Her decision to go with you came after she was already free, not as a condition of freedom. Boss. He looked up. The question a judge would ask is whether, in practice, a woman in her condition in that situation had genuine alternatives. Victor's lawyers will argue she didn't. We argue she did. That you offered shelter with explicit conditions of no obligation, no contract, no requirement of any kind. That's the truth, Cole said. "The truth is our best material," Drummond said, which was either a statement of principle or something more cynical, and Cole wasn't sure which. "What does this do to the timeline?" Cole asked. "It buys Victor a hearing in the local court before Coburn gets to the estate ruling. The marriage challenge goes through the county court here, which means whoever sits on that bench will hear it first." Drummond set down his pen. "Who's the county judge?" "Man named Hargrove. William Hargrove." Drummond looked at him. "Any connection to the man you bought this ranch from?" Cole stopped. "His son." They sat with that for a moment. "Has Hargrove been in Victor's pocket before?" Drummond asked. "I don't know. I've never had cause to be in his court." Cole was thinking carefully. "He's been the judge here 6 years. He's not known as corrupt. He's known as methodical. Methodical I can work with, Drummond said. We need to make sure everything we present is airtight. Every date, every document, every witness. He paused. Evelyn needs to be in that courtroom when it happens, not as a prop, as herself. Judges read people, and Victor is going to present her as a desperate woman who was manipulated. She needs to be present so the judge can see who she actually is. She'll want to be there anyway, Cole said. Trying to keep her out of it would be the mistake. Good. Drummond picked up his pen again. The hearing will be scheduled within 3 weeks. That's the usual timeline. He looked at Cole over the desk. You need to understand what's at stake in this hearing. If Victor succeeds in voiding the marriage, everything resets. May loses the Mercer name. Evelyn loses the legal standing. Victor gets his path back. Cole said nothing. I'm not saying that to alarm you, Drummond said. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that this is the moment. Whatever happens in the next 3 weeks matters more than Coburn, more than Reno, more than the affidavit right now. Victor knows that. He moved to this specifically because he knows it. Cole drove back to the ranch in the dark, on a road he knew well enough to follow by feel when the clouds covered the moon, which they did for most of the ride. He was thinking about a lot of things. About the hearing, about William Hargrove and what kind of man he was, about Victor sitting in whatever comfortable room he'd rented in Caldera Crossing, planning the next step with his polished lawyers and his long patience. He was also thinking about May, who had been alive for less than 2 weeks and had already become the center of a legal war she had no knowledge of, and about Clara, who had started saying his name, just Cole, nothing attached to it but his name from her mouth, which landed differently than he'd expected, and about Evelyn, who was at the ranch right now, probably aware that something had happened because she was always aware when something had happened, and waiting for him to come back and tell her what it was. He came through the door at 9 in the evening, and she was at the kitchen table, awake, with May in the cradle beside her chair and a lamp on the table and her hands folded in her lap. She looked at his face and said nothing for a moment. Tell me, she said. He sat down and told her. She listened to all of it without interruption. When he finished, the house was quiet around them. The small sounds of the fire, the baby's breathing, the distant sound of wind moving through the eaves. 3 weeks, she said. About that. She looked at the baby. What do you need from me? To be yourself, Cole said. In that courtroom. Exactly yourself. Not performing anything, not managing how you come across. Just Evelyn. He paused. Drummond says Hargrove reads people. Let him read you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, and if he rules against us? Then we appeal to Coburn directly and we fight it from there. Cole said it steadily because she deserved a steady answer. But I don't think he will. You don't know that. No, Cole agreed. I don't. She nodded slowly, accepting the honesty of it. Outside, the wind pushed against the house, testing the walls the way winter always does, looking for the place that gives. The walls held. They weren't perfect walls. There were gaps around the north window that Cole kept meaning to recaulk, and the porch boards needed replacing in 2 places, and the barn door still didn't hang quite right. But they held. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday, which gave them 18 days to prepare, and Drummond used every one of them. He rode out to the ranch twice in the first week alone, arriving in the early afternoon both times, tying his horse at the post near the barn, and spreading papers across the kitchen table while Evelyn sat across from him and Cole stood near the window or leaned against the counter, depending on what the conversation required. May slept in the cradle nearby. Clara sat on the floor with Brackett and listened to everything with the careful, cataloging attention she applied to the world. The first visit was about documentation. Drummond needed everything in order. The original debt settlement from Purcell's office, the marriage certificate, May's birth certificate, the timeline of events from the auction through the filing in Sutterton. He organized these into a sequence that told a story any judge could follow. A woman freed from debt, offered shelter without conditions, choosing marriage freely, a baby born legally within that marriage. Clean lines. No gaps Victor could wedge open. Purcell's records are going to matter, Drummond said on the first visit, spreading the debt settlement document on the table. This shows that the payment discharged the obligation completely. Evelyn walked away from that auction block owing Cole Mercer nothing. Her choice to accept his offer of shelter came after, not before or during. Victor's lawyers will argue the obligation was implied even without a document, Evelyn said. They will, and will counter that implication requires evidence, not assumption, and that the only evidence is a woman who went to a ranch, did the work she said she'd do, and made her own decisions. Drummond looked at her. Including the decision to marry. They'll try to paint that decision as desperate. Then we make sure the judge understands what the alternative was, Drummond said. Not abstractly, concretely. Victor's lawyers are going to frame this as a vulnerable woman being maneuvered by a man who saw an opportunity. We frame it as a capable woman assessing a dangerous situation and choosing the most effective tool available to address it. He paused. There's a difference between a woman who was manipulated and a woman who made a calculated decision. Hargrove needs to see the second one. Evelyn looked at the papers on the table. He needs to believe it's true. It is true, Cole said from the window. I know, she said. I'm saying he needs to see it's true. There's a difference between a fact and a fact that registers. She looked at Drummond. What does Hargrove respond to? What kind of judge is he? Drummond thought about this with the honesty of a man who didn't want to oversimplify. Methodical, as Cole said. He doesn't like loose ends or emotional appeals. He responds to evidence that's organized and arguments that follow a clear line. He's presided over property disputes, estate matters, contract disagreements. He's comfortable with complicated financial situations. A pause. He is not historically a judge who rules in favor of women in domestic matters. That's not a secret. It's just the reality of how he's operated. The kitchen was quiet for a moment except for May making a small sound in the cradle and settling again. So we don't make it a domestic matter, Evelyn said. Drummond looked at her. Go on. We make it a contract matter, a property matter, a question of legal procedure. She leaned forward slightly. Victor is arguing that the marriage should be voided because it was coercive. That's a domestic argument. It requires the judge to make a judgment about the emotional state of the people involved, which puts us on Hargrove's unfavorable ground. But if we reframe it, she paused, working through it. The marriage was a legal instrument deployed in response to an active legal threat. It was executed correctly, witnessed properly, filed in accordance with the law. Voiding it requires demonstrating a specific legal defect, not an emotional one. The coercion argument is an emotional argument dressed in legal language. Drummond was quiet for a long moment. That's exactly right, he said. Then to Cole, your wife is very good at this. I'm aware, Cole said. Evelyn looked faintly annoyed at being discussed in the third person while present. I spent 6 months watching Victor dismantle everything Daniel built using legal language as a weapon. I've had time to study how it works. But the second week was harder, in the way that the second week of waiting is always harder than the first, because the energy of preparation starts to thin, and what's left underneath it is just the waiting itself. Cole kept busy with the ranch. There was always something. And Evelyn kept busy with May, and with Clara, and with the letters she and Drummond exchanged about specific points of the argument. But the nights were long, and the cold had settled in properly now, the kind of deep November cold that makes the dark feel like it's pressing against the windows. One evening, late, when May was asleep and Clara had been asleep for an hour, and the house had gone to its nighttime quiet, Evelyn came downstairs and found Cole at the kitchen table with a lamp on, and Daniel's financial records spread out in front of him. He'd been going through them for Drummond, organizing them by date, looking for anything that might support the argument about the estate. She stopped in the doorway. You've been in here 2 hours. Couldn't sleep, Cole said. He straightened the papers. Some of these accounts go back 8 years. Daniel was meticulous. Evelyn came in and sat at the table, across from him. She looked at the papers for a moment. Her husband's handwriting, his careful columns of figures, the record of a life's work. She picked up one page and looked at it without speaking. He was a good man, she said. Not as an explanation, just as a fact she was putting in the room. I can tell, Cole said, from the records, the way he structured things. He was thinking about the future. Always. She set the page down. He knew Victor was a problem long before he died. He knew Victor would try to take things if he was gone. The will was his attempt to wall it off. She smoothed the corner of the page with her thumb. He just didn't anticipate how far Victor would go. Cole said nothing. Sometimes saying nothing is the right thing. I think about it sometimes, Evelyn said. Whether Daniel could have done something differently to protect us better. Whether I could have. She stopped. And then I remember that we did everything correctly. We followed the law. We documented everything. We trusted the right mechanisms. And Victor still took it all in 6 months. She looked at Cole. That's what makes me tired. Not the work. The fact that we did everything right and it didn't matter. It's mattering now, Cole said. We don't know that yet. No, he agreed. But Drummond's on the right track, and Coburn is looking at the ruling, and Ruth Caldwell gave us the affidavit. He looked at her across the table, across Daniel's papers. That's more than you had 6 months ago. She considered this with the skepticism of someone who'd learned not to count on things that hadn't happened yet. But she nodded, slowly, the way she nodded when she accepted something as true, even if she was still uneasy about it. Go to sleep, Cole said. You're up every 2 hours with May. You need whatever rest is between those. She stood up. Then she paused at the doorway and said, without turning around, For what it's worth, I know what this has cost you. The money, the time, the trouble. Your fence line is still broken, and I know you had plans for that land before we arrived. She stopped. I think about that. Cole looked at the lamp for a moment. The fence can wait, he said. It's waited this long. She went upstairs. Cole sat for another half hour with the papers, and then he put them in order and went to bed himself. The Monday of the hearing arrived with the particular clarity of a cold winter morning. Skies sharp and pale blue, frost on the porch boards, the kind of light that shows everything without warmth. Cole hitched the wagon before first light and had it ready when Evelyn came downstairs with May bundled against her chest, and Clara in her winter coat, hair neatly braided. Mrs. Foss had agreed to watch the children at her own house during the hearing, which Cole had arranged without discussing it with Evelyn first, which she noticed. I would have agreed to that, she said, in the wagon, looking straight ahead. I know. I should have asked. Yes, you should have. They rode in silence for a mile. Then Evelyn said, Thank you for arranging it. You're welcome. Another mile of silence, and then Clara said from the back of the wagon, Is the court like school? Cole considered this. It has a judge, which is something like a teacher, but nobody gets a grade. Clara thought about this. What do they get? An answer, Cole said. Clara seemed to find this satisfactory. She turned to watch the road behind them, and the wagon moved through the cold morning toward Caldera Crossing. The courthouse was the largest building in Caldera Crossing aside from the church, a square, solid structure of rough-cut stone that had been built to last and had succeeded. The courtroom itself was on the second floor, with high windows that let in the winter light and rows of wooden benches that were already half full when Cole and Evelyn arrived. Small-town justice attracted an audience. There was nothing to be done about that. Victor was already there, seated at a table on the right side, with 2 men who had the polished, expensive look of Carson City attorneys. He was dressed better than anyone else in the room, which Cole suspected was intentional. The unconscious language of a man who wanted to establish who was more substantial before a word was said. Victor glanced at Cole when he walked in. His expression was composed and gave nothing away. Drummond was at the left table with a stack of organized documents and a steadiness about him that Cole recognized as the particular calm of a man who has done this enough times to know that anxiety doesn't improve the work. Good, Drummond said when Cole and Evelyn sat beside him. He looked at Evelyn. How are you? Ready, she said. All right. Remember what we discussed. Short answers to direct questions. Don't elaborate unless I signal you to. Let them ask the question fully before you respond. And if you don't understand something, say so. Don't guess. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I've understood everything that's been done to me for the past year. I think I can manage a courtroom. Drummond nodded. Fair point. Judge William Hargrove entered at 9 o'clock precisely, which told Cole something about him before he'd done anything else. He was somewhere in his 60s, lean, with the posture of a man who'd spent decades at a bench and had made peace with sitting for long hours. He had a face that had not gone soft with age. The lines in it were the kind made by concentration rather than expression, and his eyes moved around the room once, taking a census before he sat down. We're here on a motion filed by Victor Hartwell challenging the validity of the marriage of Cole Mercer and Evelyn Hart, filed in this county on the 14th of October, Hargrove said. He didn't look up while he said it. He was reading from the filing, confirming he had the right case. Mr. Hargrove, the elder Victor Hartwell's attorneys are present. Mr. Drummond, representing the Mercers. He looked up. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, both sides said, nearly simultaneously. All right. Mr. Kellner, you filed the motion. Present your argument. The lead attorney for Victor, a man named Kellner, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who'd spent his career making complicated things sound simple, stood and laid out the argument cleanly. His core claim was this. Cole Mercer had paid Evelyn Hart's debts on the day of the auction, placing her in a position of financial dependency. He had then offered her shelter at his property, which she had accepted because she had no other viable option. The marriage that followed, 17 days after this initial transaction, had been conducted in circumstances where Evelyn Hart had no genuine freedom to refuse, making it, in practical terms, a coerced contract rather than a voluntary one. He did not raise his voice. He cited two legal precedents involving contracts entered under financial duress. He referred to Evelyn throughout as the widow Hart rather than Mrs. Mercer, which was deliberate and which Hargrove didn't correct. When Kellner finished, Hargrove looked at Drummond. Mr. Drummond. Drummond stood. He was slower on his feet than Kellner, older, less theatrical. But Cole had noticed that he never wasted a sentence. Your Honor, the motion before you rests on the premise that Mrs. Mercer lacked genuine freedom of choice at the time of the marriage. I want to address that premise directly because it requires a specific kind of evidence to support, and that evidence does not exist. He laid the Purcell document on the table and turned it toward the bench. On the day of the auction, Mr. Mercer paid the full outstanding debt owed by the late Daniel Hart's estate, $218, to the creditors represented by Gerald Purcell. This transaction is documented in Purcell's records. The legal effect of that payment was immediate. The debt was discharged, the labor contract was voided, and Evelyn Hart walked out of that auction legally free of any obligation to anyone. He paused. Mr. Mercer's offer of shelter came after this moment. It was an offer, not a condition. She was free to decline it. Kellner was on his feet. An offer made to a pregnant woman in November with no money and no housing is not a genuine offer in any practical sense. I didn't interrupt your argument, Drummond said pleasantly. I'd appreciate the same courtesy. Hargrove said, Let Mr. Drummond finish, Mr. Kellner. Drummond continued. The argument that the offer wasn't genuine because the circumstances were difficult is an argument that applies to virtually every decision made by anyone in difficult circumstances. It is not a legal standard. The legal standard for coercion requires demonstrating that the party was compelled by threat or by the deliberate manipulation of another party's conduct. He looked at Hargrove. There was no threat. There was no deliberate manipulation. There was a man who paid a debt because he thought what was happening was wrong, and then made an offer, and the woman who received the offer considered it and accepted it on terms she specified herself. He laid a second document on the table. We have the statements of two individuals who were present at the feed store that morning when Mr. Mercer made his offer to Mrs. Hart. Both confirmed that the offer was stated plainly, with no conditions of obligation, in a public place. She was not alone with him. She was not under any immediate pressure from him. She was a free woman making a choice. Hargrove picked up this Purcell document and read it. He read it fully, which took 3 minutes, during which the courtroom was quiet enough that Cole could hear the person behind him breathing. Kellner's response, when it came, was to call Victor Hartwell to the stand. Victor took the witness chair with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the most credible person in the room. He was composed, concerned, and articulate, the performance of a worried family member doing the difficult but necessary thing. He spoke about Daniel with apparent grief. He spoke about the estate with apparent responsibility. He spoke about Evelyn with apparent regret, framing her as a woman who'd been taken advantage of by a stranger who'd seen an opportunity in her vulnerability. Cole watched Hargrove while Victor talked. The judge was not visibly moved, but he was listening. That attentive, slightly inclined listening that meant he was tracking something, Then Drummond cross-examined. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, standing at a distance from the witness chair that was neither confrontational nor deferential, "you mentioned your concern for your late brother's estate. Can you tell the court when you first consulted an attorney about your claim to that estate?" Victor said, "After the will was contested, the date, if you have it." A pause. "I believe it was late January, after Daniel died in December. January of last year. The will contest was filed in February." Drummond picked up a document. "The will contest was filed on behalf of Victor Hartwell by the same Carson City firm representing him here today. The retainer agreement for that firm is dated January the 7th, 8 days after Daniel Hart's death." He looked at the document, then at Victor. 8 days. The courtroom was very quiet. "You were engaged with these attorneys before your brother was buried," Drummond said. "I was protecting my family's interests. You were planning a legal challenge before you'd finished grieving." Drummond set the document down. "In your testimony, you described Mrs. Mercer as vulnerable and in need of protection. Can you explain to the court what protections you personally offered her in the weeks after your brother died, before she was required to leave the family home?" Victor shifted slightly. "I reached out. Did you offer her housing? The housing situation was complicated by the estate. Did you offer her money to cover Daniel's debts?" "The debts were—" "Mr. Hartwell," Drummond said, with the patient directness of someone who has all day, "yes or no? Did you offer Evelyn Hart any material assistance in the months between your brother's death and the day she appeared at an auction in Caldera Crossing?" The silence stretched 3 seconds. 4. "No," Victor said. Drummond turned to face the bench. "The man who did is sitting at that table, and you're asking this court to void the marriage he entered into with her." He let that sit for a moment. "I have no further questions." Evelyn was called to testify. She took the witness chair the way she did most things, without performance, without the artificial composure that tends to look like composure rather than be it. She was just Evelyn, direct, careful with her words, slightly tired around the eyes because she was still getting up twice a night with May and had been in a courtroom for 3 hours. Kellner questioned her first. He was skilled at it, gentle, concerned, framing his questions to suggest that she might have been confused or pressured without quite saying it. "Mrs. Hart, Mercer," she said. A pause. "Mrs. Mercer. When Mr. Mercer made his offer to you on the day of the auction, did you feel that you had genuine alternatives?" "Yes," she said. Kellner hadn't expected that. "Could you describe what those alternatives were?" "I could have found a position as a housekeeper or a cook in town if any family had been willing to take in a woman 9 months pregnant with a young child. I could have traveled to the nearest city and attempted the same. I could have written to Daniel's family, his cousin in Sacramento who had offered assistance once, some years ago." She looked at Kellner without any particular emotion. "I had alternatives. They were all more difficult and less immediate than Mr. Mercer's offer. I chose his offer because it was the most sensible one available to me. That's not the same as having no choice." Kellner tried a different angle. "Were you aware, when you accepted the marriage proposal, that it would affect your legal standing in relation to Mr. Hartwell's claims?" "Yes," she said. "And that was a factor in your decision?" "It was a factor," she said. "It wasn't the only factor." "What were the other factors?" She looked at him steadily. "I had known Cole Mercer for 17 days. In that time, he had paid my debts without asking for anything in return, offered me shelter on terms I set, ridden 3 days to another city to get evidence that could save my daughter's inheritance, fixed a cradle he found in the barn for the baby without being asked, and sat at a kitchen table with my silent child until she felt safe enough to speak." She paused. "I was aware of the legal advantage of marriage. I was also aware of who I was marrying. Both things are true." Gimachike Machishu. Hargrove, behind the bench, had stopped writing. Drummond asked her 2 questions on redirect, both brief, both designed to establish timeline rather than emotion. Then Hargrove asked 1 question of his own, which Cole hadn't expected. "Mrs. Mercer," the judge said, "if Mr. Mercer had not appeared at that auction, if you had been purchased by another bidder, or if no one had bid, what would you have done?" Evelyn thought about it for a moment, not performing thought, actually thinking. I don't know, she said. I'd like to believe I would have found another way. I don't know what that way would have been. She met the judge's eyes. But I do know that whatever I'd done, it would have been my choice to make. What happened at that auction shouldn't have been legal. A woman's future shouldn't be auctioned to settle debts she didn't create. She stopped. The fact that someone intervened to stop it doesn't mean I was incapable of handling my own life. It means someone else thought basic decency required him to act. Those are different things. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his papers and made a note. Sub. The ruling came 4 days later, delivered in a written decision that Drummond brought to the ranch on a Thursday morning. He came without drama, which told Cole something about the outcome before the document was opened. He sat down at the kitchen table and read it to them. Hargrove had denied Victor's motion. His reasoning covered 3 pages in his careful, methodical handwriting, and Drummond summarized it without embellishment. The court found no legal basis for coercion because the debt had been discharged before the offer was made. The marriage had been entered voluntarily by a party with demonstrable awareness of her situation and its implications, and the motion relied on an emotional argument, vulnerability, rather than a legal one. The marriage stood. Evelyn sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and said nothing for a moment. "It's not over," Drummond said. He said it because he thought she needed to hear it, not because he thought she'd forgotten. "I know," she said. "Victor will appeal. He has grounds. Not strong ones, but grounds. And the Carson City firm is still active." He set the ruling down. "But Coburn has confirmed he'll hear the estate challenge in Reno in the new year. With the Caldwell affidavit and the Hargrove ruling on the marriage, which now supports Evelyn's standing, we have a real case." "How long?" Cole asked. Cole Shie. "The Reno hearing is scheduled for February. If Coburn rules in our favor, Victor's entire legal architecture collapses. He loses the estate claim, the will gets reinstated, and the custody question becomes moot because there's nothing left to claim custody over." Drummond looked at both of them. February is 10 weeks away. 10 weeks was a long time. Cole knew that. Evelyn knew it better. But Drummond wasn't finished. He reached into his coat and pulled out a second document. This one, not a ruling, but a letter. "This arrived at my office yesterday from the state attorney's office. They've opened an inquiry into the manner in which the witness was made unavailable during the original Millhaven proceeding." He set it on the table. "Specifically, into whether Victor Hartwell or anyone acting on his behalf offered inducements to the Caldwells to relocate prior to the ruling." Cole looked at the letter. "An inquiry. It's early. It may go nowhere, but it means Victor now has a state attorney looking at his methods, which is a different kind of pressure than a civil case." Drummond paused. "Men who operate the way Victor operates rely on nothing being examined too closely. The moment examination begins, things have a way of surfacing." Evelyn picked up the letter and read it. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but something in her shoulders settled. Some tension she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing it. "He's not going to walk away easily," she said, still reading. "He's going to fight the appeal, and he's going to make the next 10 weeks difficult." "Yes," Drummond said. "And there's a chance Coburn rules against us. A smaller chance than there was before today. But yes." She set the letter down. She looked at Cole across the table, just looked at him, the way she did sometimes when she was taking stock of something, deciding what it meant. Then she said, "We keep going." "We keep going," Cole agreed. Drummond gathered his papers and left before noon. Cole walked him to his horse. "Hargrove," Cole said. "What changed his mind, do you think?" Drummond thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. "I think he's seen enough property disputes to recognize when a legal claim is being used as a weapon rather than as a legitimate assertion of rights. Victor's motion had the shape of law and the substance of something else, and Hargrove is good enough to know the difference." He put his papers in the saddlebag. "And I think Evelyn Mercer made an impression." "She does that," Cole said. He watched Drummond ride out, and then stood at the fence for a moment. The light was flat and cold, and the grass had gone the color of old straw. The east fence line was still broken. 3 sections of it needed resetting, and he hadn't touched it since fall. He'd need to get to it before the ground froze too hard to work. He stood looking at it for a while, just the broken fence and the cold field and the low winter sky. And then he went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table with a cup of warm milk. And May was in the cradle making the small exploratory sounds she made when she was awake and not yet unhappy about it. Evelyn was at the stove. The kitchen smelled like the soup she'd had going since morning. Nothing fancy, just vegetables and the remains of a ham bone, the kind of thing you make when you need warmth more than you need a meal. "Drummond gone?" she asked, without turning. "On his way." She was quiet for a moment, stirring. Then, 10 weeks. 10 weeks, Cole said. He sat at the table across from Clara, who pushed her cup slightly toward the center of the table and then pulled it back, a habit she had with things in front of her while she was thinking. "Are we going to win?" Clara asked. Cole looked at her. She was 7 years old, and she asked the question with the particular directness of a child who's learned that adults often don't answer the real question, and she'd rather just ask it plainly. "I think so," he said. "I'm not certain, but I think so." Clara considered this. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of someone who has decided to accept an uncertain answer because it was at least an honest one. May made a sound from the cradle. Not crying, just announcing something, the way she did. Clara slid off her chair and went to the cradle and stood looking down at her sister with an expression that had become, over the weeks, something Cole recognized as proprietary in the good sense. The fierce tenderness of a child who has decided that this small person is hers to look after. "She's awake," Clara said. "I hear her," Evelyn said, and moved away from the stove toward the cradle, and the kitchen settled into its ordinary rhythms. The soup, the baby, the child, the cold light through the window. And Cole sat in the middle of it with his hands around a coffee cup and thought about February and what it would mean, and about the broken fence he'd get to next week, and about the fact that the state attorney was opening an inquiry into Victor Hartwell's methods, which was the kind of thing that had a way of pulling loose threads and following where they led. He thought about Evelyn's answer in the courtroom. Both things are true, and about how much work it had taken to get to a table where that sentence could be said plainly, in front of a judge, and have it mean what it meant. He thought about Clara asking, "Are we going to win?" and about his own honest, uncertain answer, and about the nod she'd given him, trusting it not because it was certain, but because it was real. Outside, the afternoon light was going. The cold pressed against the windows in its patient winter way. Inside, the soup moved toward ready, and May had been picked up and was making slightly different sounds now, better ones. And somewhere upstairs, Brackett was moving from one room to another, following the warmth the way old dogs do. 10 weeks to February. Victor Hartwell still in whatever room he was using to plan his next approach. The state attorney's letter in Drummond's files. The Caldwell affidavit. The Hargrove ruling. The pieces laid out on the board. Not in their favor yet, but not against them either. Just arranged, waiting for the next move. The way most things worth fighting for are arranged in the long middle of the fight, where the outcome is still genuinely open, and all you can do is hold the ground you've taken and keep going. Cole finished his coffee. He got up and found a bowl for the soup. The 10 weeks between Hargrove's ruling and the Reno hearing were not quiet weeks. Victor appealed the marriage ruling within 8 days of receiving it, which nobody was surprised by, and his Carson City attorneys filed 3 supplementary motions in the county court over the following month, each one narrow, each one designed not so much to win as to generate paperwork and consume time and money and energy. Cole recognized the strategy because Evelyn had named it early: delay, exhaust, overwhelm. Make the fight so expensive in every sense that the other side eventually decides the cost is greater than what they're protecting. What Victor had perhaps miscalculated was the specific nature of what Cole Mercer was protecting. Cole was not a man who had a great deal left to lose. He had a ranch, a broken fence line, a 14-year-old dog, and a modest account at the Caldera Crossing Bank. He also had, as of October, a wife and 2 daughters, and a child who had started calling him by his first name, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't paying attention, watched him with the careful, considering eyes of someone who was deciding something slowly and didn't want to be rushed. There was nothing in Cole's life that Victor Hartwell could threaten that mattered more than those things, and that made him a harder target than Victor had likely anticipated. You cannot exhaust a man who has already decided that the cost doesn't matter. Drummond filed responses to each supplementary motion with the patience of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years, and understood that patience was itself a form of pressure. He filed them completely, correctly, without flourish. He sent copies to the state attorney's office, which was still conducting its quiet inquiry into the Millhaven proceedings. And he continued preparing for Reno. Doesn't. The state attorney's inquiry produced its first concrete result in the middle of January, on a Wednesday morning when Cole was replacing 2 sections of the east fence and Evelyn was inside with May and Clara, the 3 of them in the warm kitchen doing the ordinary interior work of a cold day. The letter arrived with the afternoon post. Helen Greer had taken to flagging anything addressed to the Mercers and sending it out by the first available rider, a service she offered without being asked and without charging for it. Cole came in from the fence at 4 o'clock and found the letter on the kitchen table, already opened, because Evelyn opened all correspondence that came to the ranch on the grounds that it concerned her equally, and she didn't see the point of waiting. She was sitting with it in her hand when he came through the door. Her face had the still processing quality it got when something significant had landed and she was sorting through what it meant before she said anything about it. "The inquiry," she said. Cole hung up his coat. "What did they find?" "Enough." She held out the letter. "The state attorney's office has found documentary evidence that a representative of Victor Hartwell's legal team made a payment to the Elko Mining Company in the amount of $300, 2 weeks before the Millhaven ruling, around the same time the Caldwells were offered the position in Elko." She looked at Cole. "It's not a signed confession. But it's a financial record that connects Victor's attorneys to the Caldwells' relocation at exactly the right moment." Cole read the letter. It was careful and formal in the way of official correspondence, stating facts without conclusions, outlining what had been found and what would happen next. The state attorney was opening a formal investigation into potential obstruction of a civil proceeding. Victor Hartwell and his attorneys had been notified. "This changes Reno," Cole said. "It changes everything." Evelyn set her hands flat on the table, that gesture she made when she was steadying herself against something large. If Victor is under formal investigation for obstructing the original proceedings, Coburn isn't just reviewing the will ruling on its merits. He's reviewing it in the context of potential fraud. She stopped. Victor's entire claim was built on a ruling that was obtained by removing the witness. If the removal of the witness was purchased, then the ruling isn't just procedurally wrong, Cole said. It's tainted. Yes. They sat with that for a moment. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd been upstairs, apparently, and had come down without them noticing, which was still something she did sometimes. She looked between them. "Good news or bad?" she asked. "Good," Evelyn said. Clara nodded and went to check on May in the cradle, satisfied with the answer, not requiring elaboration. She was 7 years old, and she had learned to read the difference between the kinds of quiet in that kitchen, the worried kind and the other kind, and she trusted her own reading of it, which Cole thought said something about how far she'd come from the child who had pressed her face against her mother's side at an auction block and said nothing at all. Bruschet. They rode to Reno in the first week of February. It was a 3-day journey, done with a hired wagon and Tom Eller driving while Cole and Evelyn sat inside with the children, bundled against the February cold that came off the mountains in waves. May, who was 3 months old and had developed strong opinions about most things, had strong opinions about being in a closed wagon for 3 days and expressed them. Clara held her for long stretches of road, which helped, and sang to her in a low voice. Songs Cole didn't recognize. Probably songs Evelyn had sung to Clara when Clara was small, passed down the way those things are passed, without anyone deciding to pass them. Cole watched the landscape move past the wagon's canvas opening and thought about the first time he'd made a decision about these people. Standing at the base of that auction platform with $240 in his coat and a feeling he didn't entirely understand, looking up at a woman who wasn't asking him for anything, and a child who wasn't looking at him at all. He'd made that decision in about 30 seconds. It hadn't felt like a turning point at the time. It had just felt like the thing to do. He'd learned in the years since Margaret died to be suspicious of things that felt like the right thing to do, because feeling wasn't the same as being right, and he'd made decisions before on the basis of feeling that had cost him. But some things were different. Some things you just knew, and the knowing wasn't emotional exactly. It was more like recognition. Like you'd seen the situation before in some essential way, and you knew what it required. He still didn't know what to call what had happened since. He wasn't sure he needed to call it anything. It was what it was. a life that had expanded when he hadn't expected it to, that had filled with the specific weight of other people's presence in a way that changed the shape of everything around it. He thought about Margaret less often now, not because she mattered less, but because the present had gotten louder. He thought she would have had something dry and accurate to say about that, and the thought made him feel something that was close to comfort. But Basi o Basasani. Reno was larger than Caldera Crossing in every sense, noisier, more crowded, the streets carrying the particular energy of a city that was still deciding what it was. Drummond had arranged accommodations and met them at the hotel on the evening of their arrival, going over the final points of the argument in the sitting room while May slept in the bedroom and Clara sat in the corner reading a book Cole had bought her at the last town stop, a collection of frontier stories that she'd been working through steadily, pausing occasionally to ask what words meant. Coburn will hear arguments tomorrow morning, Drummond said. He's requested that both parties submit their primary evidence in advance, which we've done. He's reviewed the Caldwell affidavit, the original will, the Millhaven ruling, and the state attorney's findings about the payment to the mining company. He looked at his notes. Victor's attorneys have requested a 2-week continuance on the grounds that the state attorney's investigation is ongoing and introduces new variables. Will Coburn grant it? Evelyn asked. I don't believe so. The investigation is ongoing, but the findings it's produced are already on record. Coburn doesn't strike me as a judge who rewards delay tactics with delay. Drummond set down his notes. This is going to be decided tomorrow, one way or the other. Evelyn looked at Cole. Then she said to Drummond, What's your honest assessment? Drummond was quiet for a moment. He was a man who didn't give optimism as a courtesy. You asked him honestly, and he answered honestly, which was part of why Cole had chosen him. Honest assessment, Drummond said. The Caldwell affidavit alone would have been sufficient to reopen the procedural question. The state attorney's finding about the payment changes the character of the case from a procedural appeal to a challenge of a ruling obtained through improper means. Coburn has spent his career being the judge that men like Victor Hartwell couldn't get to. He takes a specific kind of personal offense at the use of legal procedure as a weapon. He paused. I think we win. I'm not certain, but I think we win. Nobody slept particularly well that night. Judge Elias Coburn was not what Cole had expected, which was probably a consequence of having spent months building an image of the man based on his reputation. He was younger than Cole had pictured, mid-50s perhaps, with a broad, plainly featured face and the kind of physical stillness that isn't the same as passivity. He read the room the way Hargrove had read it, with a single sweep before settling, but where Hargrove's gaze was methodical, Coburn's was direct in a way that made you feel slightly examined. The courtroom was formal in the way of federal proceedings, quieter than Hargrove's county court, more deliberate in its pace. Victor sat at the opposing table with Kellner and 2 other attorneys, all of them assembled with the composed readiness of people who'd prepared thoroughly and were not accustomed to losing. Victor himself was harder to read today than he'd been on the porch or in the county court. The investigation had put something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but the kind of alertness that comes from knowing that scrutiny has moved into territory you'd prefer unexamined. Coburn dispensed with opening arguments quickly. He'd read the submissions. He had specific questions. He asked Drummond to address the chain of custody for the original will, how it had been maintained, where it had been since Daniel's death, why it had not appeared in the original Millhaven proceeding. Drummond answered precisely, presenting the document itself and the explanation of how Evelyn had kept it, and Coburn looked at the will for a considerable time, reading it front to back. He asked Kellner to explain, on the record, the legal basis for the Millhaven judge's ruling that the witnessing had been improper. Kellner gave a careful answer. Coburn asked him 2 follow-up questions that were so specific about the procedural requirements for will witnessing in this jurisdiction that Kellner's answers became progressively less certain, which Coburn noted without comment. Then Coburn asked about the payment. The state attorney's office has identified a payment of $300 from an account associated with the Hartwell legal team to the Elko Mining Company, made approximately 2 weeks before the Millhaven ruling, Coburn said. He was reading from the document, not from memory, which meant he wanted the exact words on record. Mr. Kellner, can you explain the nature of that payment? Kellner stood. Your Honor, that payment is the subject of an ongoing investigation, and we would respectfully, I'm not asking you to speak to the investigation, Coburn said. I'm asking you to explain the payment. What was it for? A pause. We're not in a position to characterize, Mr. Kellner. A payment was made by your client's legal team to a company that employed a key witness in a civil proceeding in the weeks before a ruling that depended on that witness being unavailable. Either you can explain what that payment was for, or you cannot. Which is it? The silence in the courtroom was the particular kind that comes when a very skilled attorney runs out of road. We cannot characterize the payment at this time, Kellner said. Coburn wrote something. All right, he said. He asked no more questions of Kellner. He looked at Drummond and said, Is there anything further you'd like to add on behalf of your clients? Drummond stood. Only this, Your Honor. The original Millhaven ruling rested on a single procedural deficiency, the unavailability of one witness. We have demonstrated that the surviving witness, Ruth Caldwell, attests unambiguously to the proper execution of the will. We have also placed on the record evidence suggesting that the unavailability of the other witness was not accidental. The ruling that stripped Evelyn Mercer of her late husband's estate was obtained through a proceeding that was, at minimum, compromised. We ask the court to overturn it and restore the original will. He paused. Daniel Hart was a man who worked for 20 years to build something worth leaving to his family. He wrote his will carefully and had it witnessed correctly, and his wishes were clear. The only reason those wishes haven't been honored is that his brother had the money and the connections to prevent it. Drummond looked at Coburn steadily. The law shouldn't be a tool for that. We're asking the court to confirm that it isn't. He sat down. Coburn looked at the papers in front of him for a long moment. The courtroom waited. I'll have a ruling by end of day, he said. They waited in a small room adjoining the courthouse that Drummond had arranged access to. The four of them, Cole, Evelyn, Drummond, and Clara, who had come because there was no one to leave her with and who sat in the corner with her book, reading with apparent calm, though Cole noticed she hadn't turned a page in 40 minutes. May had been left with the hotel proprietress, a competent woman who'd raised 6 children and treated the assignment with professional ease. The wait was 4 hours. Nobody said much. Drummond reviewed his notes. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the window. Cole sat beside her and didn't try to fill the silence, because some silences don't need filling, and he'd learned by now which kind this was. At one point, Evelyn said, without looking at him, Whatever happens, don't finish that, Cole said. She looked at him. Whatever happens, things are different than they were in October, he said. The marriage stands. May is legally ours. The state attorney is investigating Victor. Whatever Coburn decides today, those things are true. He paused. I'm not saying we don't need this ruling. I'm saying whatever happens, we're not back at the beginning. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, That's a reasonable thing to say. I thought so. Clara, in the corner, turned a page. Cole suspected she'd been listening to every word. The bailiff came at 3:30. Coburn's written ruling was 12 pages, which Drummond scanned with the speed of someone who knows how to find the operative language in a legal document. Cole watched his face. Drummond's face was not expressive in the way of people who perform their reactions, but it had tells. A slight loosening around the eyes, a change in the set of his jaw. Cole saw the tell after about 30 seconds. Drummond looked up. He overturned it. The room was very quiet for a moment. The Millhaven ruling is vacated, Drummond said, reading. The original will is reinstated as the valid and legally binding expression of Daniel Hart's testamentary intent. The estate, the land, the assets, the bank deposits, reverts to the beneficiaries named in the will, which is Evelyn Hart and her children. He kept reading. Coburn also referred the matter of the payment to the state attorney's office with a formal recommendation for prosecution, and he issued a judicial censure against the Millhaven judge for failing to adequately investigate the procedural question before ruling. He set the pages down. Victor has 30 days to vacate any assets he's collected from the estate. The court will appoint an administrator to ensure compliance. Evelyn sat completely still. Clara put her book down. Cole said nothing because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate to the moment, and he'd learned that about moments. Some of them you just have to let be what they are. Then Evelyn made a sound, short, involuntary, The kind of sound that comes out before you decide to make it, and put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes went bright and then wet, and she sat there with her hand over her mouth and her eyes full, not crying exactly, just on the edge of it, holding the weight of 12 months of fighting in a body that was very tired of carrying it. Clara crossed the room and sat down beside her mother and leaned against her arm. She didn't say anything. She just put her small weight against Evelyn's side and stayed there. Cole looked at the two of them, and then looked at the window, and the winter light coming through it, flat and cold, and absolutely indifferent to what had just happened in this room, which was exactly as it should be. The world didn't reorganize itself around your victories any more than it reorganized itself around your losses. It just kept going. You were the one who had to figure out what the victory meant. Victor Hartwell did not leave quietly. He filed an appeal of Coburn's ruling within the 30-day window, which nobody was surprised by. But the appeal was narrow and the grounds were weak, and the appeals court dismissed it 6 weeks later with a ruling so brief it almost seemed curt. The state attorney's investigation concluded in April with a formal charge of civil fraud against 2 members of Victor's legal team and a civil suit against Victor personally for damages related to the improper manipulation of the Millhaven proceeding. Victor's attorneys negotiated a settlement. The terms were not public, but Drummond told Cole that it involved a substantial payment and a consent decree that effectively barred Victor from any future claim against the Hart estate. Victor returned to wherever he'd come from. Cole never knew exactly where that was and didn't particularly want to know, and his name did not appear in any correspondence after May. He didn't disappear dramatically, he just stopped, which was, Cole thought, exactly the right ending for a man like that. Not a courtroom defeat with an audience, just a quiet withdrawal from a fight he'd finally run the calculations on and found no longer worth having. Spring came late that year the way it sometimes does at altitude. A long, reluctant loosening of the cold, the ground giving up its frost incrementally, the grass coming back in stages rather than all at once. But it came. The east fence got repaired in March, when the ground softened enough to work the posts. Cole did most of it himself over a week of mornings, and on the third morning, Clara came out in her coat and boots and stood watching him for a while, and then picked up the spare post driver and asked if she could try. She was small for it, but she was serious, and she figured out the technique after a few attempts, and they worked 2 sections of fence that morning without talking much, just the rhythm of the work and the cold air and the sound of the posts going into the ground. Evelyn came out at mid-morning with coffee and stood looking at the fence line. "It's straight," she said. "Straighter than it was," Cole said. "That's all you can ask of fence," she said, and went back to the house. Clara watched her go and then looked at Cole. "She always says things like that. I've noticed. It used to bother me." Clara considered the fence post in front of her. "It doesn't anymore." Cole drank his coffee. "What changed?" "I figured out she means something by it." Clara picked up the post driver again. "She doesn't just say things, she means something by them." Cole thought about that for a while after. It was an accurate observation about Evelyn. She said what she meant and meant what she said, and she'd been doing it since the moment she'd stood on his porch and told him she wasn't going to perform gratitude every morning to make him comfortable. He'd found it startling at first. Now he found it the most reliable thing in his life, which was not a category he'd expected to have a most reliable thing in again. May's first real laugh happened on a morning in April, when Brackett, old, deaf, arthritic Brackett, who had been slowing down all winter in the way of old dogs getting ready for something, rolled onto his back in a patch of early sun on the kitchen floor and made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a sigh. May, who was on a blanket 2 feet away and had been regarding the dog with the fixed attention she applied to most things, found this so compelling that she made a sound of her own, high and bright and completely unpremeditated, a sound that surprised even her, because she went still for a moment after it, as if listening to where it had come from. Evelyn was at the stove. She turned around. Clara, at the table, looked up from her book. May did it again, smaller this time, but real. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Clara said, with the authority of a 7-year-old who has decided something is good, "She's funny." "She's very funny," Evelyn agreed, with a voice that was doing the thing it did sometimes, carrying more than the words it was carrying. Cole was in the doorway from the barn, having come in to refill his coffee, and he stood there watching the 3 of them. Evelyn at the stove with her eyes bright, Clara at the table with her book forgotten, May on the blanket discovering that she could generate something in the people around her, and thought that this was the kind of moment you couldn't plan for. You could only be present for it when it arrived. Brackett rolled back onto his side and went to sleep, indifferent to having caused it. It was a Saturday in late April when Clara said it. They'd been working in the small kitchen garden that Evelyn had decided to put in on the south side of the house, a project that had expanded from its original modest scope, as projects do when someone with Evelyn's particular relationship to follow through gets started on one. Cole was turning soil. Evelyn was marking rows with string. Clara was carrying seedlings from the barn in a wooden tray, making trips back and forth with the careful efficiency she brought to physical tasks. And May was in a basket near the garden in the thin spring sun, watching everything with the concentrated attention of a 4-month-old for whom the world was still basically a series of extraordinary events. Clara set down her tray and looked at the row Cole had just turned and said, without particular preamble, "Papa, that row is crooked." Cole stopped. Evelyn looked up from the string she was holding. Clara looked at the row and then at Cole and seemed to become aware, from their stillness, that something had happened in the word she'd just used. She looked slightly uncertain, not afraid, just unsure of the ground. Is that okay?" she asked. "To say?" Cole looked at her. She was 7 years old and she'd had a father and lost him, and she'd been silent for 3 months, and found her voice back slowly, word by word, and she was standing in the garden dirt with her hands still chalky from the seedling tray, asking him if it was okay. "It's more than okay," Cole said. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the row again. "It's still crooked." "I'll fix it," Cole said. She picked up her tray and went back to the barn for the next load of seedlings. And Cole stood in the garden with a tilling fork in his hand and looked at the crooked row, and couldn't have said exactly what he was feeling, except that it was large and it was real, and it was the kind of thing that doesn't come with language because language wasn't built to hold it. Evelyn was looking at him from across the garden. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He fixed the row. They finished the planting. The spring sun moved across the sky the way it does when you're not watching it, and by the time they went inside, the light had gone golden and long, and the garden had its first rows in the ground, imperfect and real, and theirs. There are things that people say about family, that it's blood, that it's a given, that it arrives with you when you're born and remains whether you want it or not. There's some truth in that. But there's another kind of family that nobody talks about as much, maybe because it's harder to explain. The kind that gets built in the middle of difficulty, assembled from the materials available, held together not by biology but by the decision, made repeatedly, to stay. Cole Mercer had not been looking for a family when he walked into Caldera Crossing on a cold October morning for a bag of oats and a barn hinge. He'd been managing his life, doing it adequately, getting through, which is what you do when you've lost so much that wanting things starts to feel dangerous. He'd reached the age of 43 having made a kind of peace with the diminished version of himself that grief had made. And if that peace was more resignation than acceptance, he'd stopped examining the difference. What he hadn't expected was that the things he'd lost, the particular noise and weight and difficulty of other people, the way a house changes when it contains more than one life, were not gone from him. They'd just been waiting for circumstances that made them possible again. He hadn't become a different man. He'd just been given back something he'd stopped believing he had any right to. Evelyn Hart had not needed saving in the way the story might suggest. She'd needed someone to remove an obstacle that shouldn't have been there. An obstacle made of money and legal corruption and the particular cruelty of a system that had decided women were leverage rather than people. The moment that obstacle was addressed, she did what she'd always done. She handled things. She was not a woman who required rescue. She was a woman who required a fair fight, and for most of a year she hadn't had one. What she'd chosen, after the debt, after the shelter, after the marriage that was a legal strategy before it was anything else, was a different thing from gratitude. She'd chosen, over the course of weeks and months, to be known by someone, to let the real, difficult, unmanaged version of herself occupy the same space as another person and not perform anything about it. That choice had cost her something too, because being known requires trust, and trust after what she'd been through was not a small thing to give. Clara had come back to language not because someone had fixed her, but because she'd been in a place long enough to feel safe enough that the words had somewhere to go. That's how it works with children, and sometimes with adults. You can't make them ready. You just have to be present and reliable until they get there on their own. And May, who had been born into a legal war and slept through most of it, who laughed at an old dog and watched the world with steady, considering eyes that looked more like her mother's every week, she would grow up knowing none of this the way it had actually been. She would know it as stories, as the shape of who her family was, as the reason her mother held things firmly, and her father worked fence lines in the early morning, and her sister could be quiet and be present and trust that quiet without feeling it. That's what survival leaves behind when it goes well. Not just the people who made it through, but the particular way they learned to be with each other, which is shaped by what they survived, marked by it, different from what it might have been under easier circumstances, and not lesser for that difference. Check. Brackett died in early June on a warm morning when the grass had come back fully and the ranch looked the way it only looks for a few weeks a year, green and possible and not yet beaten down by summer heat. He went the way old dogs go when things have gone well for them, quietly, in a patch of sun on the porch, without drama. Clara sat with him for the last hour. She'd known before anyone else that he was going, and she'd come out and sat beside him with her hand on his side and stayed there. Cole came out at some point and sat on the porch step nearby, not saying anything, just there. When it was over, Clara was quiet for a while and then said, "He had a good life." "He did," Cole said. "Did he know we loved him?" "Dogs always know that," Cole said, which he wasn't entirely sure was true, but believed enough to say it. Clara considered this. Then she asked if she could help dig the grave, and she did, working steadily alongside Cole in the soft earth near the old oak at the edge of the property. And when they were done, she stood looking at the small mound of turned soil for a while and then said, "I'm going to remember him." "So will I," Cole said. They went inside together. The Mercer Ranch did not become a perfect place. The fence needed attention every season. The roof leaked over the bunkhouse in hard rain, and Cole kept meaning to fix it properly and kept patching it instead. The cattle prices were difficult 2 years running, and there were winters when the money was tighter than Cole liked, and decisions had to be made about what to defer. Evelyn's temperament and Cole's did not always fit without friction. She was direct in ways that sometimes landed harder than she intended, and he was prone to handling things quietly that should have been said out loud, and they had conversations over the years that were uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure, which is probably the only kind worth having. Clara grew into a person who was serious and funny in alternating measures, who read everything she could find and had opinions about most of it, and was not shy about saying so. She became, in her teenage years, a significant help on the ranch, not because she was required to be, but because she'd decided the work mattered and did it with the same focus she brought to everything. She called Cole Papa without hesitation from that Saturday in the garden onward, and if there were complicated feelings in that, she kept them as her own, and Cole didn't ask her to share them before she was ready. May grew up loud and curious and slightly reckless, with her mother's directness and something else that was purely her own, a particular joy in things, a willingness to throw herself at the world that made everyone around her both nervous and glad. She was, in all the ways that matter, a Mercer. She knew about Daniel Hart. Evelyn made sure of that, told her about him honestly, the good and the complicated both. And she carried that knowledge without it diminishing anything about the family she'd been born into. The dead don't have to compete with the living. There's room for both. The estate from Daniel's will was eventually administered through a court process that took most of a year to resolve. The land in Millhaven County was sold. Evelyn didn't want to return there, and Cole didn't push it. And the proceeds became the foundation of something more stable than the ranch had ever been before. A second draft horse. The roof fixed properly, finally. A real school subscription for Clara, and later for May. And still enough left to put in a bank account that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a future rather than just a margin against disaster. Victor Hartwell was convicted in civil court of fraud in connection with the Millhaven proceeding. The sentence was financial, a substantial judgment against him, and he spent several years contesting it before eventually settling. He was not, as far as Cole or Evelyn ever knew, imprisoned. He became over time a smaller and smaller concern, until the day came when neither of them thought about him at all, for weeks at a stretch, and then months. And then he was just a chapter from a year that had happened, part of the story of how things had become what they were. That's the thing about people who use power as a weapon. They tend to be most formidable when they're unexamined. Put a light on what they've done and make them account for it, and they turn out to be ordinary, smaller than the damage they caused. Men who bet on the likelihood that the people they hurt wouldn't have the resources or the will to push back, and who miscalculate when they do. There's something Cole understood by the end of it, something he might have told you if you'd asked, though he wasn't the type to offer it unprompted. He'd believed, for 9 years, that the version of himself that existed after Margaret and Lily was the only version available. That grief had drawn a line, and that what came after the line was necessarily diminished. He'd managed his life on that assumption, and he'd done it competently enough that it had looked, from the outside, like a complete life. What he hadn't understood was the difference between managing a life and living one. The difference isn't about happiness, exactly. It's not about things being easier or more comfortable. Evelyn at the kitchen table at midnight going through legal documents was not easier than being alone. Clara's silence in those first weeks, her careful, watchful presence, was not comfortable. The 10 weeks before Reno were some of the hardest weeks Cole had lived through since the winter of 1881. None of it was easy, but it was his. It was actual. It had weight and consequence, and the particular kind of meaning that only comes from things that can go wrong and sometimes do. He hadn't been surviving it. He'd been inside it, all the way through. That's the difference. And it's large enough that, if you've ever been on the wrong side of it, you know it immediately when things change. He'd been on the wrong side of it for 9 years. He hadn't known how to get back until a cold October morning handed him a reason to stop standing at the edge of things and step in. On a Saturday in the following October, 1 year, nearly exactly, from the morning of the auction, Cole was on the porch before breakfast, as he always was, with his coffee and the early light. The frost had come back, glazing the porch boards and the fence posts and the tops of the fence rails where the east fence ran straight and solid across the field. The sky was that particular early October blue that you don't see in other months. He heard the door open behind him, and then Clara was beside him, leaning her arms on the porch railing, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She'd come down early again. She did that sometimes, had inherited some version of his early morning habit, or arrived at it herself, he wasn't sure which. They stood in companionable quiet for a while, looking at the field. "Same hawk," Clara said. Cole looked. There was a hawk circling over the east field, high and lazy, banking in the cold air. He wasn't sure it was the same one she'd pointed out on the wagon road to Sutterton a year ago. Hawks looked more or less like hawks, and that had been 12 months and many hawks ago. But he understood what she meant. "Same hawk," he agreed. She smiled at the field. It was a real smile, easy and unselfconscious, the kind that Clara had been increasingly capable of in the past several months. Not performing ease, just having it. Inside, May made a sound that traveled through the house, and then Evelyn's voice, low and warm, answering it. The sounds of a house that had people in it, real people with particular voices and habits and ways of taking up space, doing the ordinary work of a morning. Cole drank his coffee. Clara watched the hawk. The field held its frost in the early light, and the hawk turned above it, and the house held its warmth at their backs, and nothing about any of it was perfect, and none of it needed to be.